Hello out there, and welcome to the No Shit Cast, the flagship podcast of the X Factory Creative Network. I'm your host, Matt Frazier. Tonight's guest is an American author in the fields of business, particularly office politics and project management. He does alternate history novels relating to World War II, and he's worked in and designed role-playing game adventures such as Dungeons & Dragons, Indiana Jones, and Buck Rogers. He's a TSR veteran, and he's our guest on deck. My co-host tonight, the Grey Wizard of History and Useless Information himself, Mr. Eric Smith. How are you?
Hello, good.
So a lot of interesting stuff going on with the show coming up, folks. Obviously, Tangent has just been killing it for us over there at the X Factory. The website, getting it ready for our March 1st official launch. And we've been busy. The show's been doing very well. So thanks out there to everybody for all the likes and shares. We really appreciate it. Amazed, I guess, at how fast our viewership and stuff is growing. So thank you again. And we're booked up here, Eric, for the next 5 or 6 weeks, right, with interviews.
Oh, yeah. We got Ken St. Andre coming on the 28th of January.
Okay.
And after that, we have Steve Sullivan, who is an author and game designer, on the 3rd of February. On the 10th of February, we have DJ Version 666, who is a DJ and musician.
Yeah, that's from the X Factory.
Yes, yep. And on the 17th of February, we have Professor Cooperman, who is coming in to talk about his theater
Political
connections.
Theater guy.
Yeah,
Yep.
between New York and Dublin, Ohio. On the 24th of February, we have Skip Williams coming in to talk with us about his career at TSR and the things that he did.
Very cool.
And then finally, on March 3rd, we have Muggsy, who is Reverb Nation's #1 hip-hop artist in Sydney, Australia.
Australia, right.
Yeah,
It's
yeah.
the crazy stuff.
Yeah, it's going to be fun.
So let's get off that now. Move on to our guest tonight, Michael Dobson. How are you doing this evening?
Very good. Yourself?
We're fantastic here.
Yeah, definitely. I was looking, some of the information that I got off of Wikipedia. So if there's any errors or anything, just let me know. But
My birthday's wrong.
Okay. It's correct
It's
on Facebook, though, right?
I believe so, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so you have been involved in writing in a lot of different styles and genres and stuff. When you were growing up and things like that, like, how did you get involved in writing? At what age were you when you realized that you really liked writing and wanted to do that in some sense as a career?
Well, I'm always put in mind of something the late Rich Brown, a science fiction writer for the Amazing Crowd, used to say. He said, "I hate writing. I love being a writer, but, I hate writing." I was a reader more than anything else. I read just voluminous amounts of science fiction, not so much fantasy, and was kind of interested in actually my childhood dream was running a bookstore, which is like completely economic suicide. But fortunately, I dodged that bullet. I read a lot of science fiction. I started in science fiction fandom in like 65, and I lived in Alabama at the time, and went to a Deep South Con in Huntsville, which was just up the road. And among other things, they were playing Diplomacy. And so that was my first taste of hobby gaming. Later on, had a small gaming club in this town of Decatur, Alabama, which was the largest city in the United States, still under Prohibition at the time I lived there.
Wow.
I did gaming. I did fandom. I published fanzines. I did major in writing I guess in college, to answer your question. I started thinking that it might be possible, though I knew enough writers to know how unlikely it was. But I went to a little school in Charlotte, North Carolina, because my grandparents lived there and I had no money. And interestingly, the creative writing teacher there was a woman named Bertha Harris. At the time, she was known for these very artsy novels. She had been an editor at Grove. After I knew her, she became better known as the co-author of The Joy of Lesbian Sex.
Wow.
So it was very interesting for a nowhere college creative writing class. It's quite amazing because 3 of us turned pro in a group at a class of like 10.
It's a statistical anomaly almost, huh?
Yeah, yeah. Lloyd Rose, who wrote some Doctor Who novels and has also written episodes of Homicide and Kingpin, and Julia Willis, who was one of the founders of lesbian stand-up comedy and the author of several humor books and one very nice novel. So it's sort of interesting. So it's a very active group. I had a weekend job as operating the local planetarium. There's the Big Dipper, this sort of thing. And
that's very cool.
right through a complicated set of coincidences, that led me to get a job at the National Air and Space Museum at the Smithsonian.
Okay, well, hold on. Just I have to ask now. When you were younger and you were reading these science fiction novels and stuff, and you said that you got into writing fanzines. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but that's where you're writing about, say, for instance, the Star Trek universe with the original characters, but it's an original story, right?
Oh, no. Fanzine fandom. There's a website, a wonderful website called efanzines.org, and I still publish, and mine is called Random Jottings, and it's basically the leftover corner of the personal journalism hobby that it went into science fiction because H.P. Lovecraft was big in that hobby, and a lot of his early fans and enthusiasts crossed over into science fiction, and so these are just personal magazines on all kinds of things. I did one issue on Watergate. I did an issue on I drove through the middle of a mass murder in progress in '75, and I just finished chronicling that. Wow. I mean, it's an interesting site. They're all free. I wrote an encyclopedia of cognitive biases and decision disorders.
And what is that called again?
It's called Random Jottings. As you can see, it's a well-chosen name.
Okay. And
the issues are free. It's a downloadable PDF. You go to efanzines.com.
Efanzines.
Yeah, we want to make sure we get these links to put them in the descriptions for you for the podcast.
Okay, got it.
Right, efanzines.com, and the name of mine is Random Jottings. There are wonderful things there. I mean, it's worth a look around.
I didn't mean to interrupt you, though. You were telling me about one that you'd written.
Oh, yeah. So, I mean, that's what fanzine writing was about. A lot of fanzine writing is in-joke stuff about other fans. But it was a very involving hobby. It was like the bridge that allowed me to break free of Decatur, Alabama, and move into the wider world.
Wow.
Yeah.
And who was your favorite author back then that you read?
Heinlein, head and shoulders. Juveniles especially, which I still think are just exquisite examples of craft. But I read everybody. I like Alfred Bester and Cordwainer Smith and H. Beam Piper and, Fred Pohl and William I mean, just, all these folks.
Yeah, nice.
I really, I sort of immersed myself in it. I'm actually a member of the semi-secret invitational Lords of the Instrumentality, a private Cordwainer Smith enthusiast group chaired by Robert Silverberg and with some other people, and Harlan Ellison is in it.
Wow.
Again, a weird set of coincidences. So anyway, I did aviation history, museum development, and later sort of public contact stuff. I was the business manager of the planetarium, and so I helped build the place, and that let me poke around. My immediate boss was an ace with the Flying Tigers and a former test pilot, his boss his boss was Mike Collins, the Apollo 11 command module pilot. Ron Miller worked there, the space artist, the astronomical artist. I mean, it was just an amazing time. I mean, just everybody came through.
So is that where you got your first taste of things like World War II and things like that? Got an interest in those things?
Although politically, being on the curatorial side of the house, everybody wanted to do World War II, and I had no seniority. So my research specialty, to the extent I had one, was air transportation between the Curtiss Condor and the DC-3, flying boats, and lots of airships. Love airships.
Wow.
That'd be a great job. I mean, that's every kid's dream job.
Yeah.
I was a huge Chuck Yeager fan as a kid, read his biography and all that. So, man, that place is just like, ugh. It's like a candy store.
He was around from time to time. I never met him. I rode in an elevator once with Jimmy Doolittle.
That's cool. Did you talk to him or say anything?
Doolittle's Raiders.
No. I mean, I'd run into, sort of odd things back in college. For example, I wangled a job as Arthur C. Clarke's driver for 3 days.
Oh my gosh, that's awesome.
It was kind of fun. He showed me my first calculator. I'd never seen one before. This had been 72.
Wow.
And it paid $600 for the thing.
It was the one that had the red LEDs on it, right?
The stacked red LEDs, right? 4 functions, no memory. And he informed me that the slide rule was obsolete. So that was my glimpse into the future.
Wow. I can remember my electronics teacher talking about those and paying $600 for a calculator. I was like,
"Oh yeah, I'll never know." I'll never have one of those. A friend of mine's dad was a surveyor. Again, in the sort of mid 70s, had a computer in his air-conditioned, climate-controlled office because it was so vulnerable, and it was like $12,000, which would be probably $50,000 a day.
Oh my,
yeah.
And still, I'd never seen anything so small. But anyway, the Air and Space Museum got me a taste of that, and got me used to working with raw material history, which is, and I kind of supervised the department's volunteers, and 2 of them were Dungeons and Dragons guys.
Oh, cool.
Which is how they gave me a photocopy of White Box, D&D.
Yep.
And I played a few times, and then later in the late 70s, I had a campaign. I lived in D.C. at downtown. Do you know Alex Jerkett?
No, sir.
Eden Studios?
Nope, I do not.
Okay, they did the Buffy role-playing game and some collectible cards and stuff. They're based in Albany.
I'm aware of those.
Anyway, he came out of my club, and we had some other folks in it. A lot of them associated with the local theater. So it's a very vibrant group.
And games too, I imagine.
And I ended up then submitting. I'd been trying desperately to get into some sort of creative field. I'd left the Smithsonian in '78, and I got a job as a career counselor and resume writer, specializing in the government job application standard form 171, no longer used, fortunately. And
that doesn't sound like it might have satisfied the creative aspect.
Creative aspect, yeah.
Weirdly, it turned out to be enormously useful in fiction later on, because over the years I interviewed thousands of people in depth about everything they'd done, and got this sort of perspective on the wide world of work that you wouldn't get normally. And I find it endlessly fascinating.
Yeah, I think so, yeah.
And so I did that, but I knew Chris Claremont sort of, and leaned on I presumed on our relationship enough to get an interview with Jim Shooter, and did not get the gig at Marvel. I mean, I tried everything. I actually auditioned to be a Penthouse dirty letter editor. Didn't get,
Awesome.
didn't get that
Yeah,
one
man.
either. So I got into their offices, which just cubicles, but the waiting room, was nice. Had framed centerfolds,
Right.
and
Too bad there's no selfies at that point.
You're right. I started submitting. I submitted a few pieces to Dragon, and Kim Mohan bought one of them on material spell components. I
Okay.
tried to bring them all together and sort of make sense out of it all, and it even got reprinted in the Best of Dragon.
Yeah.
And when TSR was hiring editors, he was the overall manager of all editors, and knew me enough that I got an interview with Troy Denning and got the job. I was an editor there for about a year and a half, and
what year was that you got the job?
I joined in December of '83.
Okay.
And I just got engaged, got married the following July. And so I went there, and I was going to be an editor in the games department. And at the time, the layoff sequence had not really begun, and so I was kind of in at the peak. And then about a month and a half after I got there, all the folks who became pace setter got up and walked out the door. And then there were a couple of other rounds of layoffs. And this is when the banks forced the Blooms and the Blooms out of the company, and they laid off the entire marketing department. And I felt everybody's job was hanging by a thread. So I volunteered to be the new marketing director. I had a little bit of marketing, and so ended up, leaving the creative side, and was in the marketing and distribution part of the business for another couple of years. And then after another round of layoffs, I think round 5, there's an informal job in some companies in trouble, staff son of a bitch. And I kind of got drafted into that.
Yep.
And after the 5th round of layoffs, I ended up, they couldn't replace me in marketing immediately, so I ended up becoming head of marketing and games after, again, layoff round 5.
So what was this? Was this a market driven situation that was facilitating this?
Yeah, well, at the time, that was it. I mean, the guys who started it, Gary and the Blooms, they did not understand what we now know as the law of fad gravity.
Right.
And when the sales curve kept rocketing up, they kept projecting it along the curve.
Right.
And, at some point it peaks.
Right.
I mean, at one point we were valued higher than Mattel.
Yeah.
Wow.
You guys were in Forbes magazine, right?
Oh yeah. Actually, Inc. 500.
Okay. 500. Okay.
5th fastest growing privately held company in America.
Yeah.
And again, this is an enormously educational experience, because I ended up, I managed to prevail upon my position to get I got to do some design in the evenings and weekends, and I've done some editing. But a lot of it was sitting there trying to do whatever it took to keep us afloat while we were circling the drain.
Sure. Yeah.
And the revised and lean company made it. And I still have people I quite like who don't talk to me.
Oh, well,
it was a job. I did it.
Right.
But you became like the hatchet guy. The guy
Well, I mean, yeah, to some extent.
Yeah, you end up drawing that crappy straw.
Yeah. But I got to, but still, I got to do fun things.
Yeah.
Yes.
I was originally the line editor on Dragonlance, and cleaned up one novel when the designer, one module when the designer got overloaded and couldn't finish it. And it on my own, I did probably the piece I liked the best of everything I designed there was it's 1/3 of the second Fritz Leiber Lankmar module, City of Adventure.
Yeah.
And it's called One Night in Lankmar Makes a Proud Man Humble. And it and it's a cute little. They ran it as a tournament at Gen Con, and there's like a trick in it, and I hoped, and it did what it's supposed to and misled everybody until they got the surprise ending. I was very proud of that one.
I love the name reference too.
Yeah.
I ended up working very closely with Doug Niles, who became one of my best friends, still is. And I was the development editor on Battle System.
Yes.
And that was, it was Doug, but I played a bigger role in it than typically an editor would. And together we did the Bloodstone Pass module with battle system scenarios and fold up figures and stuff.
Yes. And I still use that product to this day, actually.
Oh, no kidding. Thank you. I'm delighted to hear that.
Oh, yeah. I love it.
And then we ended up stretching it into 4 modules. 3 is kind of forgettable, but 4 was, I decided that since all these kids liked 100th level modules, that we had to do something for them.
Throne of Bloodstone.
Bloodstone, and it's totally over the top. One of the Type 5 demons is actually Lorraine Williams, the president of TSR.
that's great, man. I did not know that.
Well, I ended up backing off a little bit. There were a few parts of the portrayal that were a bit too obvious, and I was afraid I would actually get the editor in trouble.
Right?
If I left it alone. So it softened a little bit, but that was the intention.
I can tell you when that module came out, people that I knew that were in the hobby and stuff, like my friends and stuff, they all thought it was great and brilliant. I mean, I don't know if any of them actually ever ran it, but they all went out and bought it and thought it was just the coolest thing they'd ever seen because of the levels.
Oh, well, I'm delighted. I figured out this scaling system so that the monsters and bad guys would sort of adjust so you could play it anywhere from level 15 up.
Yeah. Mostly predicated on just like people like fighters only getting like 1, 2, or 3 hit points after like 9th level and stuff like that. I remember reading like there wasn't a whole lot of difference once you got to a certain level. So yeah, man, I read through it. I've never ran it, but I've read through it, page by page, and I love it.
Thank you so much. The other thing I did that it was also different was X10, Red Arrow, Black Shield.
Yes. For
Blue Box D&D, and I was sort of going off and really I sort of itched to redo it at some point. But the idea is it's sort of like a campaign pack. You have all these things to do in an environment where a war is going around around you, and the front lines can end up moving through your current position.
Right on.
And but it was D&D, so it did not sell nearly as well.
I know, and I really liked that aspect of it. Like I really liked that you could start doing mass combat in 1st edition, and it's one of the things that got me involved in playing war games that I do today. Games like Alexander and Armageddon and Axis and Allies, and I mean, I kind of picked up the love of that through the battle system rules and such.
Oh, well, that's interesting because it goes sort of backwards. I did early Avalon Hills, Blitzkrieg and Tactics 2, and I somewhere I still have, I believe, a copy of the very first issue of ST.
Okay.
And so I played some of the early SPI stuff, and so a lot of that fed back the battle system. So I guess it's a virtuous cycle.
Did you ever play Armageddon from SPI? It was very, very early combat. One of the battles was the Battle of Kadesh.
I ended up. I used to say the D&D demographics are the 13 to driver's license and college to get a life. because it is time consuming, and I had this sort of sweet spot where I had the time and the energy and the focus and could really give them the level of attention that they deserved. And then I got to the point where I would have to give up too much else in my life. So
Yeah.
hobby games fell by the wayside.
That's what happens.
Yep. It happens a
Yeah.
lot.
Yep.
I did edit. I was the very first thing I did at TSR was SPI editing.
I was going to
rules
ask you, the
Yeah.
first 3 things you worked on, you said didn't get published, right?
Yeah, one of them finally did. Yeah, the first ones I did a top secret module and a top secret companion accessory with Merle Rasmussen. And then I did a game. It finally came out years and years and years later, La Grande Armée by Mark Akers, which is a wonderful, sort of classic Napoleonics piece. Mark is one of the people who left for Pacesetter, and I was halfway through editing his game, and so it dropped off the schedule. But I mean, these kinds of things happen.
Yep.
So where was I was on? The SPI gaming.
Yep.
One of the things I tried to do is I tried from a marketing perspective to revitalize SPI, and I had a marketing slogan: "What this world needs is a good 4-hour war game."
Yes.
And
Agreed.
I think it was Alvin Barkley, the vice president. "What this country needs is a good 5-cent cigar." I actually had a picture of Alvin Barkley who was going to make buttons out of it. I couldn't get anybody. I mean, everybody above me at the company had already decided SPI was nothing. So, I couldn't get any traction for it. But I had in mind to create a line of good, no compromise war games that were capable of, you could unpack them and play them and put them back in 4 hours.
Yeah. That's exactly how Armageddon is too. It's just
Right.
it's in a package. You unzip it, you lay it out, and 4 hours later,
you
it
do it.
pops. You're done. Yeah.
I even had we'd had 2 sets of rules. We had the regular sort of regulation numbered paragraphs rules that you would normally have, and I had Doug write down. I said, imagine you're explaining how to play to somebody who knows how to play war games, and give me 2 pages.
Oh.
And so it's you could read 2 pages and you could be in the game. You'd have that high level, and you could look up the details as you went along.
Awesome. That's cool. Yeah.
Because my other sort of the marketing thing is people love to play games. People hate learning how to play games.
Right.
Yeah.
Yep.
And it's the fundamental limit in the game business is you could make some really cool games if you let people take the time to learn them, but they're not going to. So you have this absolute limit in rules complexity
Right.
before you just start hemorrhaging audience.
Yeah.
Yeah, because then it becomes a very specialized sort of audience at that point,
Right.
doesn't it? Yeah.
Have you seen the rules for Starfleet battles from Amarillo Design Bureau?
Starfleet battles. I haven't. I mean, the old ones.
Yeah, it used to be Task Force Games.
Yeah.
Now it's Amarillo Design Bureau. They changed their name, I think.
Yeah, John Olson took that over at one point. I don't know if he's still there or not.
But when you're talking about
Yeah.
super complicated games, that's what that reminds me of. I mean, I've got like
Yeah.
2 5-inch ring binders full of rules for that game.
I mean, I get it. I get pleasure out of that sort of thing myself, but you can only ever invest in 1 or 2. It's like in role-playing games. I purchased 40 or 50. I played 2 or 3.
Yep. And it's hard to find opponents. Like if you do take the time to read and do the
find
rules
somebody
and stuff,
else that's taken the time to
Yeah.
do it.
Yeah,
right.
And if they don't
Yeah.
read the rules, they are at a disadvantage.
Yeah,
I mean,
absolutely.
you can't just invite them in, and if they don't have an idea of how the mechanisms work to make strategic decisions,
Yeah.
Yeah.
But that's true, yeah, and yeah.
It's one of those really interesting problems. I mean, the Germans have done all this brilliant stuff in board game design, really coming at it from a different perspective. It's because they also understand those dynamics, and God, they're great at game balance.
Yeah.
I mean,
What
at
you
TSR, at some point, we even stopped worrying about it. We figured every DM who had any skill could take whatever it is we gave them and make it work.
Right.
know, I was
And
They were flexible enough, with the
yeah,
rules most DMs are anyway.
right.
from Dragon Magazine, August 1985. I just wanted to ask you about this. I was reading this last night. I've read it before. I always read it before I run a game of Battle System. The main conference room turned into a miniatures battlefield for weeks on end.
Oh
Later
God!
on, every day it
yes.
seemed people were thinking up new and better uses for the game. Ultimate playtest. The final battle took place on three
Yes.
planes: the ethereal, the astral, and the prime material, with about 40% of the total forces invisible when the game began. There were divas, plantars, mezzademons, Galibs, Durar, and 10,000 Giblerines, each with a sword and a girdle of storm giant strength. There were
Right.
contained powerful monsters. There was a force of 220 invisible shadow dragons. There were 300 hand giants. See the Legends and Lore volume for details. There were
Right.
drow cavalry on nightmares. They didn't last long. It took 8 hours of playing time and 4 large deep dish pizzas to get through 2 turns, but it was an incredible amount of fun and a lot was learned.
Yes.
Can you
Oh, yeah.
tell me about
I
that?
made a huge blunder. I mean, you don't give an opening to game designers. You just don't. Um, it was I think it was build 1,000-point army,
Okay. Yeah.
and
And they just hit the
so
books.
then it was everybody doing this. John Pickens did the 10,000 items, individually low, but I mean just this enormous force. If I recall, someone had some earth elementals, and they started because they would just keep marching, and they kept erecting these great stone tablets would fall and crush the first rank, and then the second rank would come and they'd fall. You know, it was very funny. It was funny. Everybody had a great time,
It sounds like it.
especially the reveal when each person would say, "Here's my army," and they would tie. you know? And Doug and I were going,
10,000
"Oh
what?
shit! Oh God! This is never ever going to work."
we said test our game, not break our game.
Yeah.
Oh no, but that's what playtesting is: breaking the game. That's
Yeah,
what they're supposed to do, and they're very good at it.
It's a ludicrous level, right?
Yes, right. And ratcheting it down, I mean, honestly, even though when I left the game business in 91, 90, something like that, but I still had these sort of daydreams. I actually have, a Bloodstone Pass extension,
Yeah.
in my head ready to type up.
Well, and now
but-
we live in a world where self-publishing is almost easy.
Well, it's very easy, and I guess it was at TSR, and we can talk more about that. But let me highlight the rest of the stuff, and then we can talk. We can pick whatever topics you want to go
Oh
into.
yeah,
Sure.
sure.
Yep.
I left TSR to be vice president of Games Workshop US, and that was there a year or so, and it was not the world's happiest fit. And so, do you know Arnie Katz?
No, sir.
He used to be editor of Computer Game Design.
No.
Computer Games Monthly with his wife Joyce and Bill Kunkel. Anyway, Arnie at one point knew everybody in the computer business, and he got me an interview, and I got a job with this Annapolis, Maryland software company, Discovery Software, and they were trying to move from games into productivity software. That didn't make it, and I ended up picking up a temporary gig as a management speaker while looking for a real job. Found out that I was making about 3/4 of what I needed, working half time. I said, "That's cool,"
Yeah.
and ended up structuring that to give myself a chance to write where it was not the end of the world if I didn't make any money. And so I started out. Doug and I had done the proposal for Fox on the Rhine like about 92, and then no 94. I came up with the idea on a seminar speaking trip to Australia. It's like a city a day, so I couldn't pack enough books. So I was buying something in the airport and reading it on the plane and leaving it in the seat pocket when I got off.
Yeah.
And in Adelaide, in the airport, I bought a Dan Brown novel.
Okay.
And so I'm flying to Perth, and it was so bad. That novel was just so terrible that I just got sort of mentally interested in deconstructing it. I'd done my English major stuff, and it's like, why is it so bad? What is the difference between this and, say, Tom Clancy?
Right.
And I ended up filling up a couple of pages of notes of what, extracting from why I didn't like that book and comparing it to ones I liked, a set of rules for a war novel.
Oh, wow.
And I kept working on that, went to Perth, and I had to fly back to Brisbane, another 3,000 miles. And I ended up coming up with the idea that became Fox on the Rhine. I didn't have the chops. I just did not have it at all. And as it happened, I had about 6 weeks later, I had a seminar trip up to Wisconsin. So I called Doug, and we got together, and I pitched it to him, and he said, yes, let's do it. So we hacked out a proposal, gave it to Brian Thompson when TSR Wisconsin shut down. He finally managed to sell it. And we unusually got a contract on a proposal rather than on a finished book. So we had a contract, and then we sat down and worked like hell and got it done.
So it was a great idea.
And you're right. And it got, what did we get? We got Military Book Club, alternate selection, 1 international sale, hardcover and paperback. On the other hand, that's still not very much money. We did Fox at the Front.
2003.
We wanted to make it a trilogy, but ended up having to choke that one off a little bit. You can see in the middle of the book where the volume split should take place. and we actually started that when I'd gone up in September 2001 to Doug's place in Wisconsin. And we were actually starting work on Fox on the Rhine on 9/11.
Oh, wow.
So the book is, I think, it's a darker story.
Because of that, yeah.
Because we actually incorporated, not the incident itself, obviously, but some of the feelings associated with it. We sort of wrapped it in. My goal was always to write something, a World War II novel that read like one of the actual World War II writers. There's been a tendency to romanticize.
Gotcha.
And the good guys are really good and the bad guys are really terrible. And if you read sort of contemporary World War II novels, the bad guys were really terrible, but the good guys weren't all that great.
Yeah.
And there's sort of like a grittiness and kind of a lack of heroism.
Well, pre rose-colored glasses kind of interpretation. Sure.
Yeah, my dad was a waist gunner at a B-24, and he was shot down over Koblenz in 1944 and spent the rest of the war as what he used to call an honored guest of the German government.
Yeah.
And he's the same thing. People would sometimes say, wow, how heroic. And he said, I wasn't a hero. He said, I was a survivor. He says, I knew heroes. I've met heroes, but, I was just a survivor. And I get that. Oh, and by the way, one of the issues of Random Jottings on the eFanzine's website is when my father died, he had done an oral history, which was adapted into as part of a book called Four Men Went to War by Bruce Lewis, who's a UK author. And so I published the original transcription.
Oh, that's cool.
And so it's a firsthand account of a reasonably exciting World War II career.
That's great because I'm taking a World War II class this semester, so.
Well, I mean, it's to give you an interesting take on it.
Yes. Yeah.
So let's see. So I started training. I still do that because it gave me some freedom. Doug and I ended up doing 3 books together. And our editor got out of the shower one day and dropped dead of a heart attack.
Oh my.
And so we had a kind of a sweetheart champion relationship inside the company, and that did not survive his death.
That's unfortunate.
I started doing business books because business books support my speaking business. And I've written 13 books on technical project management, books on office politics, books on career management, goal setting, job hunting. I'm actually wrote the section on decision theory for was it the space? What is that? For the book Applied Space Systems Engineering, edited by it's a supervised the space technology series under the auspices of the Air Force Academy.
Oh wow, the decision theory.
Yeah, decision theory, how to make decisions.
Is there any way to encapsulate that?
Well, it's a lot of it is a technical process. The kinds of decisions they make are the sort of like technology trade-off decisions. And one of the things that I sort of observed about their decision process is that if you're in a business that is capable of having big accidents and something goes wrong, you can expect your decision process to be audited. And therefore, you must have a documented decision process.
Yeah.
And you must be able to walk people through and say, this is what I decided. Here's how I reached that conclusion. Here are the alternatives that we considered but rejected for the following reasons.
Yeah.
Here's our risk analysis, because decisions are seldom perfect. We could have this risk here or that risk there, and we thought this risk was better. So that sort of thing. I mean, as I said, most people think this is a fairly dry topic.
Actually, I find it fascinating. In fact, the book that you had wrote on getting along with coworkers that you don't like.
Well, they're actually an adaptation of a much better book that I would be happy to recommend.
Okay.
Robert Bramson, Coping with Difficult People. He's the king of that industry. That was a work for hire, quick job to fill a hole in somebody's line.
Gotcha. I had a friend who was asking me to ask you about that, and I said, okay.
Get Bramson's stuff.
Okay.
He's better.
Appreciate that.
No, I work as for years as a systems engineer. And and anything that goes boom has to have protocols, documentation. It's funny how little the average person out in the world realizes is sort of scripted when it comes to this kind of stuff. But it makes perfect sense because I was also in the military, and we had them in the military. I was in the Navy, and I got I was a Top Gun junkie and got to work on F-14s. When I was in the Navy. Where I had all my delusions shattered.
It's not just an adventure; it's a job.
Yeah, and sometimes it's a really lousy job, man. Let me tell you.
Look, my kid is a firstie up at West Point this year, so he's experiencing it from the Army perspective.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, I've seen some pictures, man. Looks sharp.
Thank you.
Sharp is the right word, right?
Yeah.
I was told when I got out of the military, because I got fired from my first job because I was, quote, abrasive. Or sharp,
That's right. It's a different sort of thing. So, but yes, I mean, systems engineering there's a big overlap in systems engineering thinking and project management thinking.
Sure.
The issues of actually getting what is the actual problem to be solved, what is the risk environment, what is the actual work breakdown structure, all of the good stuff. So anyway, I guess I've been teaching this now for almost a quarter of a century.
Yeah.
Wow.
And it's still I mean, the travel and things gets tiresome, but I find it still energizing. I like my groups, and I really sort of pride myself on the number of people in disparate occupations I've at least made contact with.
Sure.
Uh,
Yep.
because almost all of the world is dramatically more complicated than it looks.
Yes.
I have the iceberg theory of work. That is 90% of what it takes to get a job done is invisible to outsiders.
Absolutely.
And when they decide, how hard you work or what you're worth or how serious this thing is, they judge you based on the 10% they see.
Yeah. Friends, family, sometimes. Yeah.
Now, you still lecturing? You still go out and do
I still do that. Yeah, I was in I told you I was in Topeka last week.
Right. Okay. Sure.
The
Yep.
the Midwest Central Distribution, Warehousing, and Printing Hub for the U.S. Postal Service.
And you're lecturing when you do these lectures. You're covering multitudes of topics, right? It's sort of a
It's a 3-day workshop how to become a basic project manager. How to think about. I mean, because they all have projects. Some of them are like paperwork procedures projects. Some of them are hardware deployment. We've got to get scanners out to every mail carrier. How do we do that? How do we make sure that we know that they got it? What do we do about breakage and replacement? How do we, the number of things that have to be done, it just proliferates. So they're all interesting and complicated. I mean, I've done everything from them to the Navy's nuclear propulsion program.
Wow.
And
bubbleheads.
Interesting folks,
Yeah. I went to. I'm very aware of what a bubblehead. I mean, See, I'm Navy, so I can call them names, right?
I got it. Right.
Us Airedales, we get fresh air and sunlight, and then there's these guys that live below decks that have arms growing out of their heads and stuff. We call them snipes and bubbleheads.
Right. Well, I mean, I had the on land people who actually made the stuff for them.
Oh, okay.
I occasionally find somebody who'd actually served, but
different.
We did this when Doug and I weren't able to continue. The project we were working on was an alternate history Cuban Missile Crisis, and I met somebody who had because there's a Soviet sub, which is a very key element in the point of departure, and I was chatting with this guy, and he'd served on that kind of sub, and sat down and gave me this sort of insider's perspective.
Oh, that's great.
Exactly what was happening and exactly what it would feel like. So I know if we got around to writing that scene, it would have been very vivid because I had the sources.
Yeah.
And it is a great opportunity. In MacArthur's War, for example, a large part of the U.S. interrogator who is Japanese American, and his experience in the camps. I was in San Francisco. There's a museum of the internment experience. I went in, introduced myself, said what I was working on, and this guy comes down, sort of elderly Japanese American, and he'd been in the camps, but he had come out, joined the army, and was on MacArthur's intelligence staff.
Interesting.
And he spent 3 hours telling me about MacArthur.
Oh, wow. That's like a prime source.
Oh, yeah.
Well, yeah.
Like, literally.
I mean, there are other ones on his intelligence staff. I mean, that's guy that's going to know things that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And they'll talk to somebody who's got a real reason to ask them.
Yeah, sure.
Again, sometimes it's. It's what I said. I love the interviewing part when I wrote resumes. I love the getting to know some of the stories and projects.
Right.
Is the part of seminars that I love. Of the various things I've collected in my life, the thing I'm probably proudest of is the assortment of interesting and weird people I have met.
So, when are you going to start your podcast?
Yeah.
Well, the next Random Jottings is going to be a series of pieces about a man named Humayun Mirza. Humayun is he's become one of my best friends over the years. Met him on an airplane. And I was reading a biography of Rommel because we were doing research for Fox at the Front. It's like earlier in 2001, before I'd gone up to see Doug, and before the thing. So anyway, we're flying, and he says, Rommel. He said, I'm very interested in Rommel. So we started chatting about Rommel, and I mentioned like a theory that I was working on because I was trying to get the character into my head, and he said, that's very interesting. But, when I was having lunch with General Auchinleck once, he told me something completely different. And I said, you are speaking of the Auchinleck? He said, may I ask how you came to have lunch with General Auchinleck? He said, oh, he was a great friend of my father's. Okay, all right, I'll bite. Wow. Who was your father? Well, the man had a slight Indian accent. And it turned out that his father was the last, he said, my father was the last Joint Secretary of Defense of British colonial India.
Whoa.
Wow.
And when Auchinleck was head of the Indian Army, after partition, he was the first defense minister of Pakistan, and Auchinleck came over to that side. Later, he said first president of Pakistan, deposed in a coup in 1958. He says, that's why I'm an American.
Oh,
he was a World Bank careerist. And he wrote a book himself, mostly to defend his father's reputation, because the people who overthrew him did a lot to sort of make him not look good. Iskander Mirza was the first Indian to graduate Sandhurst, the first to command British troops, first in the British political service, and remarkable guy. Humayun's great grandfather, and he was the eldest male in the line of descent, was a man named Mansur Ali Khan, and Mansur Ali Khan was the last Nawab Nazim of Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa. In other words, he was the Mughal king of East India. And Humayun is the heir to the non-existent throne.
Oh wow, that's like a story in itself.
Like a real, there's a book in that someplace, I would think.
There is a book. Because with the print on demand, you were talking about the ease in self-publishing, and it is a remarkable brand new day. And in terms of like interesting things to do, I found that I could start a publishing company without inventory, a garage full of unsold books. And Humayun had a book he had written about this whole thing. It is like the biography of his family back to like the late 1600s. And a genealogy back to the prophet. And wow, he'd written this thing, and it had a university press publication. It's actually a bestseller in Pakistan, but the other one was like a university press book. It went out of print, and I grabbed it. So I have a small history press, and I published From Plassey to Pakistan, Humayun's book. I have an incredible naval history of World War II. But he was 95 years old, spent 30 years researching it, every battle in the Pacific, down to every individual ship, table after table after table. It should be a Naval Institute press book, but he didn't know how to footnote. Oh. So it's academically worthless.
Oh,
gotcha.
Even though every single thing I've checked in it is right.
So you just basically converted over into Chicago or MLA or something like that, right?
Yeah, I formatted it and edited it. I did an anthology called Improbable History.
Yeah, I've seen you post about that.
Right, and that's I have Mark Davis, who was a presidential speechwriter for Bush 1, the head of the Institute for Samaritan Studies in Holon and Kiryat Luza, the spokesperson of the indigenous Samaritan people who are still around, and including pieces by Rich Berg and Greg Benford. Greg?
No, sir, Greg, I don't. Sorry.
He's a fairly well-known science fiction writer. His latest book is an alternate history called The Berlin Project, which I got to help him a little bit on. But he was also a fairly well-known physicist who was at one point the assistant to Edward Teller, father of the hydrogen bomb.
Yeah.
And so Teller, over drinks one night, told him a story that he said he got directly from Albert Einstein about the time that Einstein ran into Hitler on the streets of Berlin.
Oh. How'd that go?
So anyway,
I bet that wasn't in the
I have
documentary.
right. Well, it doesn't show up anyplace else.
Right.
In English literature, but I mean, it's as good a source as any.
Yeah.
And then, as I said, the last one was the murder issue, and then I did a Watergate retrospective because I'm a Watergate junkie.
Yeah.
Boy,
that's suddenly become really relevant again, hasn't it?
Well, they just had the 40th anniversary
Yeah.
not too long ago. My professor, who's my advisor at university, is Dr. Mark Niven, and that's his special area of study is Watergate. And he spoke on that panel. So that's one of the reasons why it's been, I think, more relevant in the last few months.
No, that movie's coming out, right?
The Spielberg movie?
Yep.
Yep.
The Paper or something like that. Sorry,
Post.
go ahead. The Post. Yep.
That's about the Pentagon Papers,
Yep.
which sort of predates it a little bit, but yeah, it's the lead-in for it, and they're all tied together. Yeah, I wrote a piece. Are you science fiction fans?
Yes, sir.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm totally geeking out right now on Philip K. Dick's Electric Dreams on Amazon that just came out. Oh, I'm just.
There's a Hugo-winning novella by Samuel R. Delany called Time Considered as a Helix of Semi-Precious Stones. So I wrote a piece. I found out that G. Gordon Liddy's plan that led to Watergate was referred to as Operation Gemstone, with each part of the operation and its work breakdown structure coded to a particular semi-precious stone. So I wrote an article called Watergate Considered as an Org Chart of Semi-Precious Stones.
Wow. That's cool. Is that, and these are all on random jottings, right?
These are all in random jottings.
Fantastic.
Yeah. So
Okay.
anybody's interested, they're all free. Please help yourself if there's anything that you like.
I want to tell my professor about that too, because I'm sure he will like some of those, if not all of them.
The Watergate stuff is fun. Oh, and the Watergate issue, actually, there's a supplement. I did a Watergate issue, and then that's number 8. Number 9, I got this article from a man named Earl Kemp. And you don't know Earl, but Earl chaired the third Chicago World Science Fiction Convention, won a Hugo Award, and founded Advent, which was the first academic publisher in science fiction. Earl's day job, however, was he was editor of Greenleaf Classics, which was probably the largest dirty book publisher in America.
That's where he made his money.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
And because he cared a lot about his science fiction friends, he offered them all jobs. For a long time, it was kind of a rite of passage if you wanted to be a science fiction writer that you wrote some porn because you could sell it. Dean Koontz was dumb enough to put his own name on them. And has to work to keep them out of print.
Oh, wow.
There's some inside baseball.
But I mean, everybody did. Dean was in the late 60s. He was writing a humor column for a friend of mine's mimeographed fanzine, circulation of 200. But he was still a school teacher at the time. Anyway, so Earl ended up publishing Harlan Ellison, former Robert Silverberg, everybody. Earl ended up, when the Meese Commission, Presidential Commission report on obscenity and pornography was published, Earl decided it was funny to do the illustrated edition. So he added in, dirty pictures that were appropriate on every page,
right, and
released it. And of course, the Nixon administration did not find this amusing
at all,
and landed on him. And he and his boss were convicted, sentenced to 10 years. They were, however, they were released after a year, and the conviction expunged so that they couldn't appeal.
Right, because they were going to appeal it on First Amendment grounds or something to that effect, just like Larry Flynn did. Yep.
Probably would have won.
Yeah, sure.
Right. And so this one, by just wiping the whole thing out, the case became moot. And so Earl lives in Mexico. Anyway, Earl got interested and wrote me the complete inside story of his dealings with the Nixon administration, his bribery of Supreme Court justices.
Oh my God! Are you serious?
It's an incredible piece, and it is in the Watergate supplement, issue 9. Along with Richard Nixon's FBI application. which I found, and a couple of other
Wow.
pieces.
Wait, his what
And
applications?
His FBI.
It is,
Oh, okay.
yeah,
I didn't.
yeah.
Sorry.
Tricky Dick wanted
I-
to be a G-man.
That's right.
But most notably, I think what you said there was the bribery of Supreme Court justices.
Yeah.
I mean, we're talking SCOTUS levels, Supreme Court
Yeah.
justices.
Yeah.
Holy cow! I mean, that
Well, I
in
mean-
of itself should be a that's huge because wow, that's an enormous claim.
Yeah.
Wow.
Earl is one of the the most. Well, he's a sweetheart of a man. I mean, he's getting up there, and I imagine I will not see him again. But you know, he's just a great guy.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Again, science fiction and fandom especially is a very small field, and a fairly high percentage of professional science fiction writers started in fandom. One of my best friends locally is a guy named Ted White, who was editor of Amazing and Fantastic, wrote a number of novels in the 60s. Gregory Benford, who's won, I think, 3 Hugos. And, you know, a bunch of other folks. Again, it's a small field. Dean Koontz, I didn't know him well, though. He was writing a humor column for a friend of mine. You know, all of these folks kind of started in the same.
Cut their teeth the same way.
Yeah.
Yep.
And many of them worked with Earl, though I did not.
So there's a lot of Earl stories out there, kind of thing, isn't there? Yeah,
yes.
Legendary.
Yeah. He's also the guy who published Alexei Panshin's Heinlein in Dimension, the book that so incensed Heinlein. Although this would have caused a lot of problems because Earl and Heinlein had been friends, but not so much afterward.
After that.
Right. So I do that. I train. I publish a line of history books. I have a long, weird, and difficult project. I started wishing people happy birthday on Facebook, and if you connect on Facebook or any social media, I publish this day in history and the quote of the day.
Yep.
And I'm actually working on a set. I've got 100 books now done. Each the complete story of everything that happened on a given day. They range from, I think the short ones are 60 pages and the long ones are like 110. Huh. And lots of pictures and stuff. And it's kind of, I mean, the marketing concept is a birthday card you won't throw away.
Huh. Sure.
And the economics are so favorable. I mean, I can't really do much till the series is done, because if I don't have your date, what good is it? But the numbers that I have to hit to make this successful are relatively modest. And that's the other thing about the self-publishing. Now, you can do it. Random Jottings is now done by self-publishing rather than old school Mimeo or Xerox,
right?
Because it's easy. And once you're used to it, if you know anything about basic book design and basic cover design, if you have the skill, the technology is easy. It's nothing to it.
And affordable.
Yeah. Oh, very affordable, especially, you know, because you're only paying for copies made. And if a copy sells online, they print it, they sell it, they take the money, they take their piece, they send you the rest.
Yeah,
right.
Very clean.
It's kind of like going on putting something on iTunes. They're going to take their cut and you get the difference, right? It's kind of how that all works.
Right.
It's direct to the market kind of thing.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah, it's what we were talking about, the idea of how quick things like this are. We were talking about how some of these documentary crews had talked with people involved at TSR and stuff and got stories and stuff from them.
Yeah.
But then in, I think, both of the cases, they ended up in litigation and amongst themselves. Like the issue was between themselves. And I have no idea, you know, what happened or the details or anything like that. Just that it started me thinking, you know, anything that we're talking with people about, we generally post that night or the next day. So it's pretty direct, you know. There's not much time for people to be like, "Oh no, whatever," you know.
Well, notice that I'm not telling any stories except in very general senses
Sure.
about the political environment at TSR.
Oh yeah.
Yep.
I mean, there are people I like very much. There are people I was less fond of, and there's some things where I have some hard feelings. There's places where some other people have some hard feelings.
Right,
I
and
don't.
that happens a
Yeah,
lot in life, you
that's
know.
right.
Yeah,
Yeah,
as
we're
is life.
and we're not
Yeah.
looking for any of that anyway. We have no interest in those kinds of stories. I mean,
mudslinging, any
yeah,
of that kind
nothing
of
like
stuff.
that.
Yeah.
No.
although now that I think, I'd like to actually discredit a one rumor that keeps popping up.
Sure.
I'm not the world's biggest fan of Lorraine Williams, but she is often accused of having forbidden playtesting at TSR.
Okay.
Now, it certainly when I was there, that was never the case, and nobody I know from that era who was actually there has told me that, and they would have found it really delicious to tell me something
Oh,
like that.
certainly.
So
Yeah, that would have gotten
you
out
know,
had that been the case for sure.
Right. So I'm fairly confident that isn't. As I said, there were various reasons that playtesting just went by the wayside.
Sure.
But it was never, certainly to the best of my knowledge, it was never a directive from on high.
And I'm sure people will be interested in knowing things like that, you know, directly from the horse's mouth, so to
Sure.
speak.
Yeah.
Because you see it a lot, like on the pages and stuff, people that discuss these issues and stuff. I don't really, because I don't know, I wasn't there, right? I'm more of a passive observer, and still I would read about it, you know. But yeah, it's really good to be able to dispel rumors. When we had Jim Ward on the show, I was going to ask him to talk about the copyright issues with deities and demigods, because that's something that people seem to get wrong a lot too, and he ends up setting them straight a lot. But I forgot to ask him.
Yeah. If I recall, it was we didn't have licenses for Lovecraft and
Michael Moorcock.
the Moorcock or Fritz Leiber.
Right. Okay.
We ended up getting one from Fritz. The Lovecraft one, of course, went to Chaosium, who did wonderful stuff with it. And I don't really know what happened with Michael Moorcock, but I can't. It probably went to a UK company if it went anywhere.
Well, our next show we're going to be talking with Ken St. Andre, and he wrote Stormbringer, which was based on the Michael Moorcock novel. So I will ask him.
And who published that?
Chaosism or
Chaosium did that.
Chaosium?
Okay, then in which case they may have ended up with Moorcock as well. I can see that. I mean, I don't know that from my own experience. I know Ken slightly as well. In 1972, in a trek across the desert to get to the World Science Fiction Convention in Los Angeles, we ended up being stranded in a dust storm in Phoenix.
You and Ken did?
No.
Oh.
I was with some other people, and I knew Ken's name from Spanish Association, so I gave him a call, and even though he had no idea who any of us were, he came, picked us up, and took care of us for an hour or two, and drove us to the bus station to catch our bus to the next destination.
That's awesome.
He was a wonderful, sweet thing, and I think that is the totality of my relationship with him.
He seems like a really nice guy. I only know him on Facebook, but
yeah. I mean, it's certainly my brief experience. Kind and generous.
You said that you did Gen Con, I think, earlier. But do you still go to like the Gary Cons and stuff like that, or do you associate?
I haven't gone to a Gen Con since I left the industry. After I left Workshop, which would have been 89, 92, 91, somewhere, I don't remember.
Okay.
Somewhere over there. I don't think I've been since. It was kind of nice because when I worked at TSR and Gary was there, Gary was way high and I wasn't. So I never really, I knew him, but not in any significant way. But after all of that, and especially after I'd left, Gen Con was always pleasant because Gary and I would normally get a beer, and it was quite nice.
Yeah.
A lot of my memories, I've been with him on business trips and stuff, but it's not the same thing.
Sure.
Yeah.
A lot of that carries over to GaryCon nowadays. and I know they have like TSR reunions there and stuff.
Yeah.
I know you said there's some people that you had bad blood with or any things like that, but as far as I know, it's
No,
really smooth.
no. That wouldn't. No, there's nothing like that would stop me from going at all.
We should check it out because I hear that they all get together and have a really great time and reminisce and everything.
Yeah, I would be happy to see them. I don't know, um, I still know the people I was close to. You said Steve Sullivan's an upcoming guest?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, Steve and I remain friendly, and I frequently see him when I go up to visit Doug. Troy Denning and I are still friendly. Most of the people I really care. In fact, I got a Facebook message from Jeff Grubb the other day. I talk to Tracy Hickman at least once or twice a year. So I'm in contact with the ones that I would. I mean, I'm friendly with just about everybody else, but
Sure.
I mean, my friends, I'm still in contact with.
Right on.
Yeah.
Do you still do any gaming, any tabletop gaming or RPG?
I play German board games.
That's great.
My son grew up with video games and does not, and he's always amazed when I look at the credits for one of the games and I'll actually see some folks from the old days.
Sure.
Like Bruce Nesmith or Zeb Cook or Ken Ralston, and folks like that. But that's about it. But he never showed much of an interest in it.
What titles do you normally play?
But I don't play a lot of modern video games. I was a pinball.
Well, I mean, I meant the tabletop games.
Yeah. Ticket to Ride, Settlers of Catan. Was it Coliseum? I'm just sort of looking over.
Gotcha.
And I've actually got a few of the old games from my day. The Hunt for Red October, which is Doug Niles.
Yep.
Which is a very nice job. And I even have the old Avalon Hill bookcase games, Sid Sackson's Acquire, for example.
Nice.
Which is still fun to play.
I need to find that game that Trump made.
Oh, that was designed by Mike Gray.
Mike Gray?
Yeah. The Art of the Deal, I believe. It was,
yeah.
Licensed from his book. Mike Gray was one of the lead, if not the lead designer, Milton Bradley. He had been hired away. TSR brought him, on because they wanted somebody who was really a pro in the business, but brilliant. But didn't have much of a taste for management. So did some stuff for us for a while, very nice stuff, and then went back. Mel Taft, who was their creative marketing VP, again, another brilliant guy, snapped him back. And then after everybody was bought by Wizards,
Wizards
Hasbro,
of the Coast, right?
He ended up at one point, I think he was head of Avalon Hill.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, a couple of us, the two vice presidents, Jack Morrissey, Mike Cook, and I, made a run at Avalon Hill ourselves. But the Dots wanted to sell us the print shop as well as the game business, and all we wanted was the game business instead of this aging, awful game shop, which I'm sure he was eager to get sold.
Yeah.
So we could never work out a decent deal, but it would have been fun.
And now all of that is owned by Hasbro.
Yes, the whole world is owned by them.
Yeah, right.
It's futile to resist them.
But the Jack Morrissey, our sales VP, and again a big mentor of mine on the business side, was originally a Hasbro guy himself. He was a walking education in the toy business.
Just from experience, right?
Oh yeah. And we used to. I mean, it was always fun. Thanks to Jack, I met Stan.
Stanley.
Right. It was a great moment.
Wow.
I'd been like everybody else. I'd grown up on that stuff.
Yeah.
And we Marvel license, and we were in New York at Toy Fair, and we had a showroom. And Stan was being walked around by his handlers, who all seemed to think he was slow. But but that's what happens, the insiders never respect you. Only the outsiders do. So he comes in because we have a Marvel license, and I go up and I say, I'm going to take this one around. I said, Stan, I said, I'm so honored to meet you. I've been with you since Fantastic Four issue number 4. And he got a big smile on his face, threw his arm around my shoulder, and says, where were you for the first 3?
That sounds exactly like something he'd say too. Sure, yeah.
For like the next 5 minutes, I was his best friend in the world.
Yeah.
I know he forgot me at the 7-minute mark.
Sure.
But still.
I don't care.
Right.
And I don't care. We had the other good sort of TSR celebrity story is we bought a board game called Broadway because the co-designer was Mike Farrell, BJ Honeycutt on MASH.
Yeah, right. The actor.
It's a good game, the actor. And so we decided to buy the game if he would, let us put his name on it, Mike Farrell Presents. And then we invited him to be our guest, our sort of booth draws at American Booksellers Association. We did Honeymooners game. We'd actually acquired the Honeymooners set and hired Audrey Meadows,
Wow.
But for this, we brought in Mike Farrell. And Mike is married to Shelley Fabre, who sang Johnny Angel on the Donna Reed's show and was the wife on Coach.
Oh.
Okay.
And they were both. Mike Farrell is he's exactly like you'd think, kind of, shy, not very talkative, but enormously friendly and warm.
Yeah.
And she was just a delight, even though my boss got drunk and kept trying to pester her to sing Johnny Angel for him. But it was, we all went out to dinner, and Lorraine, I don't know if you ever met her, but Lorraine is heavy. So we went to this very upscale restaurant, and they pulled up there, and she sat down, and the chair broke underneath her.
Oh my God.
And all of us, the TSR people, were just like biting our lips, saying, "My God, if we start laughing, we're going to be out of a job."
Like, what do we do now?
People are passing out. Like, no, I was sick, man.
Oh, it was a great moment.
Oh my. Gosh,
awkward.
I know, like,
Yeah.
cell phones. Where were they?
Right. So we did that.
Oh my.
So what? So anyway, I'm doing that. In terms of what ideas, you said that was one of your themes in there. One of them is the magic of self-publishing and the number of things that can be done.
Sure.
I keep pestering folks. Do you know who Steve Stiles is?
No, sir.
Steve, he won the Hugo Award for fan art last year, and was he was a player in the underground comic scene in the 60s.
Okay.
And has done a lot of stuff. He drew the backup feature for Xenozoic Tales.
Okay.
Anyway, Steve, I mentioned Steve, and
Steve's.
now I was going someplace with that. Anyway, he has this sort of semi-Edward Gorey-ish style. Amazon has a rule that you can't publish public domain stuff on their system, because a lot of people took advantage of that,
Can't publish
unless you make it original in some respect. And one of the things they specifically mentioned is illustrated versions. Because you can have the same book, it's illustrated by different people. Some people will want them both.
Yeah.
And you've added value to it. And I kept saying, take a bunch of public domain novels and put some illustrations in them, and you'll have a line of books.
Right.
Wow.
That makes sense. I was going to say, I thought the whole definition of public domain was anybody could use it kind of thing.
Anybody could use it. Amazon had a problem that like you'd end up with 50 versions of Pride and Prejudice on Kindle, and a lot of them were like badly edited or not spell checked or taken from bad sources, and it was bad for customer experience. So they said, you can't do that anymore. You have to, if you want to do that, you can, but you have to add something else to it.
You can't just do a big copy paste and call it a book and try to sell it for a profit kind of thing. Okay.
And because that ends up, there is one guy on Amazon. He's got 23,000 books in print.
Holy cow!
What he does is he mines the web for public domain stuff. 1956 agriculture reports, that sort of thing. Lots and lots of public domain government publications and a lot, and puts them all up. Most of them sell less than a copy a year.
I was going to say, how much money does he make from this? But he's got so many up.
23,000.
Yeah, so that's not bad money.
But no, I guess it's a whole different approach because of self-publishing. You can do something like that. You can say, look, instead of trying to make one book really, really good that everyone's going to buy, I'm just going to try to sell something, and if I get one person interested in it, I still make money, right? Because you can do that because it's published on demand, right?
Right. I mean, for my day books, for example, I use, for the kind of information I need, Wikipedia is a fine source. Who was born on this day, who died, what are the big events, and and I don't have to write dissertations, and so it's all good enough. But there's this treasure trove of information that could be organized and made available. I had an idea of you could write a hometown book, pull out everything in there and just sell it in the local bookstores. There's so much so many new angles. You don't want to be one of the garbagey ones. You have to add value to it. You have to make it your own in some meaningful sense.
Yep.
But it is easy. It is cheap.
We went through this whole conversation with Jim Ward too about how technology is changing so many different things, right? And the ability to reach your audience directly is like there's no necessity for any kind of middle person or anything.
That's an overstatement. It's unless you happen to have the skill set to reach that audience.
Oh yeah, you got to know how to market, right?
That's right.
Yeah,
and that's the use of a middleman. It's more value added services rather than we take a piece of the action or we buy it and we give you a piece of your action.
Well, there's collaborative models too, right? Because that's this whole thing that like what we have with the X Factory is because that's the whole point of that is trying to remove unnecessary things like corporate influence on decision making in people's art and things like that. Is to minimize all of that so that the artists are free to create.
Right.
So it's funny. You're right. There's all these different levels now, but it used to be if you wanted to print something, you had to try to go sell it to a publishing company, right? And
that's right, because you couldn't afford the infrastructure.
Right.
Originally publishers were printers because if you had a printing press, you were in demand, and there weren't that many printing presses.
Right.
And they contracted that out, and they were warehousing and distribution services, and that's really what the old line publishers really are, warehousing and distribution. Random House, for example, has a 4-acre warehouse in Westminster, Maryland. And they heat it with returns.
Holy cow. They got a machine that they feed these returned books into.
Wow.
Burns them.
Right. Returns are just a terrible invention. They are putting everybody on the slow path to bankruptcy. But now I don't need their warehousing and distribution.
Right.
So what do they offer now? They offer editorial services. They offer graphic design and packaging services, and they offer marketing services, and they offer legal and accounting support.
Services, as an as-hire kind of.
I can hire all those things.
Yeah,
I can hire those things. Right. I can do some of them myself. I can hire other parts of it out. And
don't you think though that this has pushed some of the strength then back into the artist's hands for that you're not looking at this monolithic task anymore?
Actually, for a lot of people, I think it makes it worse because
really
there are people who have enough of the business skill and savvy that they can actually work and prosper in an environment like this, and it's good for them. And there are a lot of people for whom the thought of doing these things is so
crippling,
utterly crippling that they can't do anything, and they end up in worse shape than if they were just being ripped off by a publisher.
Yeah, stuck in analysis paralysis. They can't make any decision. Sure,
or they don't have the right personality skills, the kinds of skills that make a great artist. do not necessarily. I mean, the Dave Sims of this world are few and far between. I mean, Dave Sim is like the living, Dave, Cerebus the Aardvark.
I do not. Sorry.
It was one of the big successes in the independent movement. It was
Oh,
the first
the
creative
Aardvarks.
the Aardvark. Yeah.
Yeah, I know what you're talking about. You've probably seen them. They were on they had bumper stickers. They were on cars. I've seen them all over the place when I was.
Oh, yeah.
But this was
And he
back
ended
when,
up-
back in like the 70s, 80s kind of thing.
Yeah, yeah,
Yep.
yeah.
Yep.
It ended up one artist, 300 issues, one story, and collected in a series of phone book-sized volumes, which, as far as I know, are still available. He did extremely well with this by making sure, but he controlled the whole thing from end to end,
Yeah.
and he had a really unusual skill set. I mean, remarkable achievement, but it's not one that everybody can replicate, even though it was fairly
Yeah.
easy for him.
It's like that. It's like the Microsoft. Everybody, anytime someone's trying to sell you junk penny stocks, they always, Microsoft started as a penny stock, and it's
Well,
like,
that's
yeah,
right. That's
yeah.
right.
Then,
That's
how many
Yeah.
didn't?
That's right. People win $1 million on a slot machine too,
That's right. Yeah.
yeah.
and but it's not a good retirement income strategy.
No.
It's if
Well,
I
that's
back, yeah.
that's kind of some advice from you in a sense there, though. I think what you're kind of saying is you really got to kind of know what you're capable of before you
That's
sort of
right.
strike out
Yeah.
on becoming whatever it's going to be, right?
Right,
Yeah.
and this is why corporate influence is in the decision process isn't necessarily the end of the world. I mean, it depends on who the corporate influence is, but if you're turning around saying we want to have this environment for creative people who hopefully we can commercialize enough of it by enough people that there's money to be had and money to be shared. But a lot of it is then making sure that you can provide the infrastructure, economic, marketing, finance, distribution. There's just such a variety of services to perform, and they're worth something. They're worth a lot.
Yeah.
But if you provide them, you end up having to say, look, if you'd like to be successful in my sphere of things, I mean, for an all too common example is I mean, it's not as bad as it used to be, but back when I was an editor, there are people who got just really indignant when they were told that publishers would not read their stuff if they wasn't submitted double space.
Okay.
Right? There's manuscript form. And there are really good reasons for this. If you've got a desk full of these damn things and you have to put marks on them,
Yep.
it is not, but there are people who just refuse to conform. And then felt it's those nasty, bean counters in publishing. They're keeping my great book from being published.
Well, but the pushback from the artist is always, but what do I have to change to accept? You know what I mean? Like they don't want to be giving up control of their artwork.
Right.
That's what the musicians. They're always the same thing. When they come in, hey, we have to have a single. Sorry, it's a business. That kind of stuff is what the pushback from the artist is always about.
On the other hand, I make my living on words. Some words I don't actually feel that I need to own or control. I've done ghostwriting.
Okay.
And so, I'm here. I'm putting my talent in somebody else's services and to service it. They call the shots, and I get remunerated for it.
Sure.
Hopefully, well enough. I mean, it costs a lot more money to get me to ghostwrite a book than I'm likely to make if I write one of my own.
Do you ever read it after it's finally done, or do you just let go of the project when you release what you do?
I don't. I seldom read any of my books.
I spend so much time in development.
Yeah, it's. I mean, every once in a while, I'll pick up one of the novels and look in it, and there are places I go, wow, that's better than I remembered. and other places I'm going, oh crap.
But I mean, like when you're hired to ghostwrite, like when you're doing a project like that, when you turn that over to the other person and it finally sees the published part?
Oh, once it's right, it's theirs. I mean, the last one I did, it was a company that needed. It had a particular philosophy of doing business, and they decided the book is the way to do it. So I wrote them a book, which is more or less their manifesto.
Okay.
And they told me they have sold, I got a bunch of money for it, and they sold maybe 100 copies. On the other hand, they gave away 5,000
Sure.
and acquired several $1 million worth of new business.
Ah.
So they feel very good about it. There's lots of ways to make money off a book.
It was a good investment on their part,
Yeah,
certainly.
that's right, yeah. They did well with it. But all of the things they had to do to make it successful on their level, I didn't do any of those things.
You just
I wrote the book.
You wrote the
Right.
book, and then
they,
what they do
went out
after
and,
that is up to
and
them.
sold it.
They had to add the value. I had to interview them enough to understand what their idea was.
Right.
I had to sort of reality test it and push. So because if you write it and there are any holes in the idea, they become instantly obvious. So there's some back and forth to really kind of nail down their approach.
That's right back to
But
your statement that most things are infinitely more complex than most people think they are, and
Yes,
that's what you're
right.
saying right here. Is here's a whole different avenue of making money as a writer or making a living, as a stock and trade writer or author. That a lot of people, because when I think author, I think writes a story.
Yeah.
But that's true. I mean, there's
But how many musicians make money off their CDs or
Yeah,
their
right.
downloads?
Yeah.
You make it on tour. My business books are the same thing. Business books don't make me that much money. There's one book I've gotten probably less than $10,000 worth of royalties and upwards of $500,000 of bookings.
But it's an underpinning for your lecturing and for all
Oh,
this
yeah.
other stuff, right? I mean, it's
Yeah. I've met this professional speaker. He says, "I don't have a book." He says, "I got a $29.95 business card." Right? Yeah. It was one of my contributions to the book I ghost wrote. The one I knew they weren't going to sell any, so I put a $29.95 price tag on the back
so
to up the value
Yeah.
when they give it away.
it's a hustle. It's a multifaceted thing.
It's marketing. It's positioning.
Yeah.
It's one of the things in my cognitive biases book is that a number of things. For example, a salesperson is taught, if they go to the right schools and they get the training, that if you show people two items, you should always show them the high-priced one first and the lower-priced one second.
Mm-hmm.
Not because you necessarily care which one they buy, but because the customer will be happier with their final choice, whichever it turns out to be, if they're presented in that order, and they will be less happy with their final choice, whatever it turns out to be, if you do it in the other order. And the reason is that if you are shown the low-priced one and then you're shown the high-priced one, you notice all the things you get for the extra money. And even if they're not that big a deal, you feel sort of an envy in here because there's stuff you're not getting. You are compromising when you take that. If you see the high-priced one first, and then you get the second one, if you say, "Oh, that saves a lot of money, and these 5 things I don't get, I don't care about anyway,"
Right.
then you buy the lower priced one, feeling better about your decision, feeling that you haven't given up anything that you care about. You don't have the nagging sense of envy, and you're going to be happier at the end. A lot of cases like that, you do certain things because people feel better. If I give you what looks like an expensive gift, $29.95 book that really cost me $2.40 to print, but I say it's worth $30, you get it, and you're more likely to read it.
Yes.
You're more likely to
Yep.
value the information that's in it. You are more likely, and you're more likely to feel fairly well disposed to folks. One of the things in my management seminars is I point out that the laws of physics apply to people and organizations. Inertia, people call that change resistance. But a body at rest has a tendency to stay at rest, and only once in motion does it stay in motion. It's just a fundamental fact of the universe.
Yep.
Friction is a fundamental fact of the universe. A lot of the things that you do in marketing, even things like ordinary politeness, what they are, they're lubrication.
Yep.
If you don't lubricate machinery, it does not work well and is likely to break. But we don't say, "Wow, that oil is so hypocritical."
Yeah.
It's simply a contribution we make because we're dealing with human beings, and the emotional reality is as real as the intellectual reality.
Yeah.
It's a different plane, but it's real.
I can attest to that.
Right.
I know it's silly, but when I go through drive-throughs, like for
Yeah.
things like that, I always say yes, please, yes, sir, no, sir, yes, ma'am. And there have been so many times people will take my drinks off the bill or give me free drinks like in that way or something just because I was nice to them when the first four people in the line were not.
Exactly. I mean, it really does make a difference.
It does.
It's you can influence the world around you. I tend to believe in that. Smiling at people. Although there's a counter argument. Women working for a grocery store chain were told they should smile at every customer when they check them out, and they found out very quickly the women revolted against this, and it turned out that the smile, even though it's like a business smile, was taken as a sexual come on.
Oh, sure.
They were getting hit on all the time,
Yeah.
and so you do have to adjust these things. But in general, when you can do this, as I said, I lived in the Deep South, and well, I don't do my Southern very often anymore. But, though my wife says she can always tell when I've been drinking, because
Yeah.
the more I drink, the more Southern I sound. But I find, especially if I'm someplace like New York City, and I just put on just a little bit of it, well, people tend to assume I'm kind of slow, but they're very nice about it.
Right.
There are different versions of the Southern accent.
Yes, there is. Yep.
Yep.
I prefer the Virginia version because it doesn't automatically make you sound like an idiot. On the other hand, a real deep South accent, people automatically deduct 20 points out there estimate for IQ.
Oh. Yeah. I'm having flashbacks to living in Powderly, Texas, and Lamar County,
Yeah.
outside of Paris, Texas, for 6 years.
Yeah. Well, of course, when I came to Alabama, we'd actually lived in Germany before my father sold life insurance, and so we spent the 50s in post-war Germany. And I went to Kinderschule because we were on the economy. But when I was 10 years old, I spoke better German than I speak English. We came stateside, and all of a sudden things changed a lot. It was
Oh,
not.
wow. Holy cow. Yeah, think of
Yeah,
that the contrast between German and then oh my God.
Yeah.
It's wonder you didn't get whiplash.
Well, I think I did. To
or,
some extent.
or Liplash.
No, what is that movie? It's like American Graffiti,
Great
right?
movie, yeah.
Where Richard Dreyfuss, it's his last night of his high school graduation, and he's got to get out of town, but things keep interfering.
Right.
That's mine. That was my story. The night of my high school graduation, there was a midnight bus out of town to North Carolina when I ended up going to college, and I was on it.
Wow. You couldn't wait to get away, huh?
Oh, no. It was, I mean, I had Germany so I already had, a lot of people who never knew anything but Alabama could never leave it.
No, right. Yep.
I knew someplace else. And the other thing for me was science fiction fandom, because I knew people all around the country and to some extent around the world who had similar interests to mine.
And they weren't there.
Right. Yeah. And they weren't there. And that pulled me, they gave me some sense of going to someplace rather than simply from someplace.
Yeah.
And it was
Boy, there's
just
a
big
difference,
thing.
isn't there? There's a difference between running from something and then running to something. Sure.
Yeah.
Yep.
I tell people, I'm getting up toward retirement age, though it seems increasingly unlikely. But I always say there's two ways to retire. You retire from, and you die. If you retire to, you can go on to live a good, happy life. So, I mean, it's the same thing. It's just you got to figure out some way to put the direction in the right way.
Sure.
And that makes a lot of difference.
It's a mental thing almost.
It is. It
Yeah.
is. And that's the the third management principle of physics is entropy. The tendency of systems to move from order in the direction of chaos,
Right.
unless counteracted by outside energy. And that's why you get it all perfect, you get everything put together, you get it all, and it will immediately begin to decay. And again, people get very frustrated about this, but that's why I tend to frame it as physics.
Yeah. Second law of
Right.
thermodynamics. You can't escape it.
Exactly,
It's happening everywhere.
it depersonalizes it.
Yeah.
People aren't change resistant because they're mean, awful, annoying people, uh, though they may be. They're change resistant because they're objects in the universe, and they behave like every other object in the
Right.
universe.
Yeah.
Right.
In fact, I totally agree. I just had a talk with my son last night, and one of the things we were talking about, I said, look, whatever happens to you in your life, good or bad, understand it's not personal. It's
That's right.
nothing's out to get you. You had
That's
a
right.
hand of cards that you were randomly dealt, and you're making the best hand that you can play with those cards. It's not personal.
Yeah.
And
Not
we talked about it for a while, and at the end he says, Dad, I think this conversation changed my life. I was like,
Well,
wow.
there are others. There was a case. I was reading a manuscript. This guy is a retired CIA agent. See if he had something, and he said something interesting. He had been in the army, and at one point he was, in some duty, there was combat, and he came out and he finished up and he said, "Man, I love the army." And this old first sergeant looked at him and he said, "Yeah." He said, "But just remember this: the army doesn't love you back."
Not at all.
Yep.
Yeah. And that's it. Yeah, I mean, I'm glad you did that. How old's your kid? How's your son?
He is 12 going on 13. Next month
Well,
he'll be
that's a good-
13.
That's a good age to begin.
Yeah.
I mean, at that point, they are in medieval times. They would already be adults.
Yep.
Probably already married.
Yeah.
Um,
That's how this conversation actually started off. He said, "When I get a girlfriend, Dad, you're going to have to give me some advice," and that's how
right.
we started. And
Oh, yeah.
I've been reading the Elric saga, the original 6 books to him, and we're in the middle of the 3rd one, Weird of the White Wolf. So we had this conversation, and then we went right into reading that.
Very good.
Michael,
I mean,
don't you think that if more people had a fundamental understanding of basic physics and like that, one of the things that happened to me was working as an engineer and being around scientists a lot because I worked on very large stuff often. And you start to realize that all these guys talk to each other using the same, even though they're multidiscipline, right? You could have a chemical engineer, an electrical engineer, a mechanical engineer, but they all find this weird common language
yeah.
to talk to each other in, so that they're all. I don't know if you've ever seen this phenomenon. Okay.
Oh, I end up, even though I'm not of a technical background myself,
Right.
I do speak the language and I get along with them. So
So
I
you get
have
it.
enormous numbers of audiences in that field and category.
Yeah.
And they're interesting.
And when you start to bring things down in the root ways that they do, so that they can all communicate with each other, there's a problem solving process that's like built into that, right?
Yeah.
And I've always found that, because when you were saying earlier, about an object at rest tends to stay at rest, and an object in motion. I mean, those are very much like basic root physics type terminology,
Yeah.
but you're describing a personality.
Yeah.
When you're saying that, right? But a lot of that stuff absolutely does apply. Like that which
Yes.
you sort of if I always tell people, look, man, it's not about swimming harder, it's about getting the rocks out of your pockets.
Well,
That kind of thing. It's all about energy available versus energy necessary.
Right.
So look at it like that, because it isn't always about, hey, I got to put more hours in the day. Maybe it's about cutting some crap out of the day.
Well, I mean, it is. There's evidence that people who work a lot of overtime are significantly less productive than people who cap it at 8.
Right. You just
But
get
yeah,
But don't you think that if people kind of looked at that inside that, there's some sort of methodology, right? And I hear you using these terms. I'm like, man, I think this guy knows what I'm talking. I've never met very many people that can understand that.
Well, you have a basic. There's a problem in education, is that they can't afford to teach stuff like that.
Yeah.
Because, I mean, education has a couple of different roles, and one of the roles is social indoctrination. You don't really get taught much in the way of independent thinking techniques till you get into college, which is why a lot of kids in college radicalize, because suddenly they find out that all the stuff they've been told is as true is mythology. There's a really interesting book called Lies My Teacher Told Me, a critical review of American history textbooks. I mean, fascinating stuff. I mean, my mother worked on one in Alabama, finally took her name off of it because they insisted on rewriting the portion about the Ku Klux Klan to make it clear that it started as a nice, positive organization. There's if they give you the tools
Right.
that allow you to attack this kind of thing, they're going to have problems. There are consequences.
All right.
Yeah.
And
It's
yeah,
it's a prison of the mind kind of thing is what you're sort of getting at here, right? Like once
right.
you grow up under this certain set of rules, and then when you get out and you hit when you go out and the real
Yeah.
world hits you,
Yeah.
you have to
Yeah.
learn really quick that a lot of those rules don't necessarily work
Exactly.
all the time. Yeah, and it kind of leaves you adrift, doesn't it?
Right. I tell people there's a difference between a rule and a law. A rule is something that's true or works most of the time.
Right.
You know, it's almost by definition, when we say rules are meant to be broken, they are, because rules have situations in which they do not apply.
Right.
There's a rule that if you see a gun, you should treat it as if it's loaded, right?
Sure. Yep.
And that's right, absolutely. Even when you have strong reason to believe it isn't loaded, you should still treat it like it's loaded, because it's an infinitesimal amount of extra work that may save somebody's life.
Right.
However, if you plan to use the gun, you don't want to just assume it's loaded,
Right.
right? Because now you're in a different set of circumstances, and an assumption that is helpful to you
Yeah.
most of the time, one that actually contributes to your safety, has situations in which you really need to turn it upside down.
There was anecdote that I learned in the Navy. It was a gun on safe is a gun you can't use, and a gun without bullets is an expensive club.
Yes, that's right.
Right.
Well, that was Daniel Patrick Moynihan's strategy for gun control.
Is that right?
He said, yeah, his observation was, no, guns don't kill people. Bullets kill people.
Bullets kill people.
Let's limit. People can have all the guns they want. He says, I don't care. Let's control the supply of bullets.
Yeah.
He said, right at the moment, he said, we have a 100-year supply of guns already on the streets. But there's like a 5 or 10-year supply of bullets, just restrict those, and the problem eases. But it, again, lateral thinking, come at it from a different angle.
Yeah.
Yeah, like tie your shoestrings together in case ever there's a zombie apocalypse, and then problem solved.
Yeah. I end up I read a very interesting piece on education that says one of the problems is that most classes are taught with college prep in mind. If you take a science class and you want to be a scientist at some point, it's intrinsically interesting to learn methodology, learn techniques, do stuff. But for a lot of people, they need a citizen's knowledge of science. That is, they need a basic overview in education. They need some fundamental concepts and ideas.
How not to hurt yourself. Right.
That's right.
Yep.
And how to understand this in the context of the world in which you live and the things around you. And the same thing with history classes. There are people who really want to dive in, who want to study this, who want to take it apart. And then there are people who need to know the basic flow of world events. English, we need to learn, almost everybody needs basic skills in business writing, and yet high school English virtually exclusively teaches academic writing. For a few people, learning academic writing is really important because it will be the center of their lives. But for most people, academic writing is not what they're going to be doing.
Right.
And so they're going to be doing something else. So you could almost divide up the classes between ones that are designed for would-be people who want to study it, and ones that are decided to give you a well-rounded, at least executive overview of the world around you, so that you can understand enough of what's going on that you can sort of pick directions. And it wouldn't bother me as much if some of that ended up oversimplifying or even had a propaganda aspect, because it'd be put in a more general context. You're not supposed to think this is literally the entire truth. It isn't. It's there to make sure you have a basic understanding and you can use that to go forward. And that would be somewhat helpful.
Yeah, there's nothing like that.
No.
You're right. It's all about getting you for prep
For
for
college.
further academia. Yeah.
Exactly. And as I said, it's not that that's worthless, but that becomes what is taught to the exclusion of all else.
Yep.
You can get in away with more, to talk about certain things by the time they get to be seniors, juniors or seniors, and it's okay if people start with a more, fundamental, fundamentals that are knowingly somewhat abstracted. That kind of thing doesn't bother me as much.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It'd be hard in modern public education, though. You start getting into the concepts of abstract thinking. Oh wow! I mean, that in and
Yeah.
of it's just the concept of that in and of itself could be a huge deal. To look, this is the accepted reality, but what if we looked at it this way? And
That's right.
that could really make people uncomfortable.
Well, it does. I mean, it's the thing that I work on the hardest, in my own is lateral thinking, is coming at things from unusual positions.
Sure.
At Toy Fair one year, my Jack Morrissey, the sales VP, was taking me around different showrooms because you had to have somebody that they knew before you get into most showrooms. And I was in the showroom of some Hong Kong importer. It was the year the Cabbage Patch Kids were the thing, and they had Broccoli Patch Kids, and I said, oh, come on, that's just really dumb. And my boss said, he said, you don't understand. He says, intellectual property theft is the essence of the toy business. He said, the problem with that is not that it's a ripoff, but it's just a dumb ripoff. He says, there's a brilliant Cabbage Patch ripoff at this show. See if you can find it. So I looked at all the plush in the show, trying to figure it out, and nothing really struck me. So at the end, I gave up, and he said, well, you have to understand first what a retailer wants and needs. They need two things. They need stuff that is brand new and really original. And second, they need it to be just like everything else. I said, huh? He said, let's look at this. What is the gimmick? What's the fundamental gimmick of Cabbage Patch? And you remember, you adopted them.
Yeah, they had like a certificate, right?
That's right. Yeah. And he said, what else do you adopt? And I realized the answer was
pets.
Pound puppies.
Yeah,
right.
Pound puppies are exactly like Cabbage Patch, only completely different.
Yeah, yeah.
See, and from there, I have sort of abstracted, paradoxes are opportunities.
Right.
Every time you run into a paradox, instead of throwing up your hands and saying it's a paradox, it can't go any further. How can I have something brand new and original and just like everything else?
Right.
Well, you can, if you think about it. In a way, they hybridized, pound puppies crossed with baseball cards, became Beanie Babies.
Yeah.
For the collectible aspect of it and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah. That's right. And I call this stealing sideways. That is, if you want a good idea, go search for non-parallel situations. I was teaching for the Weather Channel down in Atlanta, and they were doing everything they could. They were coming up with other ways to organize and release weather data. So all their projects were, what can we do with all this weather data? And so as an exercise I said, okay, fine. What is weather data? Well, weather data is numerical data generated in real time by a government agency and made available. Nobody wants all of the information. Just about everybody wants some piece of the information processed, made graphic, displayed in different ways and organized different ways. And that's what weather data is. Does that make sense?
Yeah. It's like a lot of the apps on your phone that just shows you the temperature, and if it's rainy, it's got some raindrops in the background and says, cold as Hoth.
It's all originating in this pile of raw real-time data.
Right.
I said, it's another data stream that behaves that way. How about financial data?
Like stock market type stuff.
Well, yeah, just the whole world of financial data. That the characteristics are the same thing. It's a flow of numbers. Nobody wants all of them. Everybody wants some part of it, just pulling it out, abstracting it, moving it around. That's a business for a lot of people.
Okay.
So if you're looking for breakthrough ideas about what to do with weather data, one thing to do would be to go over and look at all the different things people do with financial data. Most of them won't port, but all you need is a couple. And now you've come at it from left field, and you've got something that nobody else has.
You just aggregate it together, kind of thing,
Exactly.
right? Yep.
Or if you want to make a business, where's another numerical stream that is underexploited? Well, do you know how Google knows whether the traffic on the interstate ahead of you is red or not?
No.
Yeah.
Well,
it's got to monitor that somehow, right? It's got to get fed into a system.
Well, that's really creative. It was a researcher at the University of Maryland. I was being interviewed in a local news, which I happen to know this. He decided that one thing we knew is that the percentage of drivers on the road with cell phones is relatively constant, right? Doesn't fluctuate very much. And those cell phones have to check in with various cell towers.
Yeah, so they triangulate them. Sure.
Right.
Yep.
And they said, what do we need? We need aggregate data on the number of cell phones switching from one to the next cell.
Yep.
And that, I mean, because they don't need to know the traffic density down to the nearest car. They have all the information they need with a nice general number, and then if it's taken too long to get a percentage of phones to the next cell tower, we know that traffic is jammed up there.
Right.
And so I thought, I mean, what a really interesting little thing. It was a data stream that was already being used.
Yeah.
Just reinterpreted in a different way now for a different purpose. Well, that's metadata and all of that, right?
Yeah, and it's the metadata they want. They don't need to know your phone number
specifically. Yeah.
It doesn't give them anything of value, and the information they want, those aggregate numbers, don't really intrude on anybody's privacy.
Yeah.
Well, the problem, but that's the problem, right? When it comes down to it, is does the mechanism that collects it collect your personal connection to it?
But they have to. The phone company has to.
And that's where it gets sticky. To collect it, you've got to collect the phone number.
Right. Well,
because you got to know the device that you're getting it from, right?
The phone company needs to collect the phone numbers, but the phone company, all it has to do is click on the number of phones that went from cell A to cell B in the last minute.
And that's what they share.
And that's what they share.
Exactly.
And so there's no individually identifying information in the information that flows to the traffic monitors.
Yeah, to the general public at large.
Right.
Yeah.
And so, if you hack that, you still wouldn't know your phone number. You hack the phone company, you can, but they have no choice. They must collect that, because if they don't know your phone number and what cell phone tower you're connected to, they can't feed you your call.
Sure.
So you have no practical choice. If you want to go dark, you have to turn your phone off.
Well, that's the truth. I mean, it's like you said, taking a different look at what's already there. And I think Steve Jobs said something about that, right? He said that the next great innovations aren't going to be like the semiconductor or whatever. They're going to be people reinterpreting existing technologies in new ways and using data and information in new ways.
That's right. But look at the first computer I ever saw. My father's insurance company bought one. It took up a floor of the office building.
Wow.
And they had to put in special, vibration dampening floors and special, extra climate stuff. And it was not quite a clean room, but you had to put little booties, paid over your shoes before you went in. And, lots of wearing tapes and people carrying around boxes of punch cards.
Right.
And I figure that, my Trio cell phone way back in the day probably had 10 times the capacity.
Sure.
I mean, we now spend more computing power on Angry Birds than we used to spend on national nuclear defense.
Yeah.
It's the truth. Yeah.
Yeah. It's
I run into this a lot in that I'm because I do systems a lot.
Right.
and you go into factories and plants that have controllers on their machinery that could be 30 years old.
Right.
And then so you have to break out the programming terminal. Well, that's on a cart.
Right.
Right. And all of this combined, all of this power that's running these, highly, sometimes dangerous processes and stuff has less computing power than a modern calculator.
Oh,
memory and all of it. It's crazy.
The onboard shuttle computer on the space shuttle was the rough equivalent of a 286.
That doesn't surprise me.
Yeah, when Neil Armstrong disobeyed his orders to not manually land Apollo 11 on the moon, it was because the onboard computer got overwhelmed. Its 48K worth of blazing online memory just couldn't handle it.
Yeah.
And so Armstrong said, "The hell with this! I'm not aborting. We're going down."
Yeah.
But it's and how recent all of this was.
Yeah.
I sometimes make a joke in my seminars. I mentioned back when dinosaurs and IBM walked the earth.
Right.
Because it feels like that. For years, I would do these one-day seminar chains, and no GPS, little maps trying to get cross country, just a nightmare to navigate. Now, there's no problem at all,
and
ever.
One of the things that we're facing, obviously, technology has had a tremendous benefit in a lot of people, and I think it's very freeing for art, like we were talking about that with artists and things like that, right?
It's a mixed blessing.
Yeah, part of what I do is eliminate manual labor.
Yep.
I mean, there's no two ways about it. I automate processes and things like that,
Yep.
and so we've been over here on this side of the fence trying to put flares up, and like we're trying to tell people, look, guys, within the next 10 years, the amount of manual labor type professions and jobs that's going to exist are they're going to just disappear. And trying to get people to say, look, you got to retrain, because truck drivers and stuff are going away.
Oh, yeah,
it's crazy.
That's right. And a lot of white collar occupations, sports writers, can now be automated out of existence.
Yeah.
Most lawyer jobs can be.
Yep.
A number of things. The number of people it would have taken me to put a book in production.
Yeah.
I can do everything on my Mac.
Yep.
We're moving into a world where I think we're going to end up with 25% structural unemployment. And it won't be because people don't retrain. It won't be because people don't work. It's not going to be because people aren't motivated.
Right.
It's a game of musical chairs.
Yep.
And there's only so many chairs, and somebody's not going to get one.
And it's scary for me because I see this coming, and then I look around at a society at large that's kind of unwilling to accept that you would not somehow be financially productive. And the question I'm asking is, okay, but where are they going to go? Right? Because the first engineering firm I ever worked for, we had 3 people that worked inside the office that just handled bookkeeping, chargeable, billable, all of that kind of stuff, right? And the engineering company that I owned, I ran off my phone.
Yeah.
That's a whole different. Think of the structural underpinnings that are just no longer even necessary. That cost and burden that you used to have. But what do those people do now? Right?
They're not going. That's right. We're going to we either have a revolution, or we'll end up going to some form of guaranteed income. Now, frankly, it'll actually be cheaper.
Well, there's countries already doing that, right?
Well, we're not anywhere close to what we need to, but we're going to have to, because there's just not going to be enough jobs to go around, and we need people to be productive consumers.
Yeah.
For the whole system to work, there has to be consumers. Right.
Exactly. It's CM Kornbluth. Yeah, I mean, my wife was a consultant in the steel industry at one point, and there was one steel company that had 2 plants. One was a legacy plant, 1,500 workers. They had a new plant, 75 workers to crank out the same amount of steel.
Right.
And there was a video of a plant they just built in Sweden, 2 people.
Right.
And they're going to go. So far, every technological revolution has created more jobs than it destroyed, but I don't see that as a law of nature.
necessarily. Correct.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's just
I mean,
kind of the way it's
maybe
worked out.
something will come. Maybe it'll work out this time.
Yep.
But there's no guarantee or assurance that it will be. I mean, we talk about jobs going overseas. All those jobs are coming right back to the U.S. Actually, the work is all coming back to the U.S.
The work is correct. The jobs are not.
The jobs.
Right.
Yeah, the third world is going to be hit more by loss of manufacturing jobs than we were, because they're not even going to have the raw material factories there anymore.
Right.
Because they'll all go back. 3D printing, eventual nanotechnology. They don't need us anymore. I mean,
I've worked with a lot of processes, to your point, where it's been turned into a highly hands-off automated process, and like you said, the work has come back. It's being done less expensive here. Right. But when that, like you said, when that plant left, it was 1,000 employees, and when the work came back, it's like 9. It's those kind of numbers, and to me, it just doesn't seem like anybody's paying attention to that. It's like, holy cow.
We have a system. That's the other thing. Evolutionary biology. A system responds to its stimuli. An organism responds to its stimuli, right?
Okay.
And if there's no stimuli, there's no response. And stimuli that are greater have a proportionally greater effect on behavior than others.
The squeaky wheel.
Yeah. But that's right. And the stimuli, our political system is set up on a 2-year cycle, which is suicidal for a country. We have turned politics into the only occupation in the world where having experience makes you unqualified.
It's true.
Yeah.
And as Otto von Bismarck famously said, no man wishes to see his laws or his sausages being made. It is.
And there's no way to not see it now.
Job. That's right. It's a big job being a member of Congress. Yeah. I mean, this is the board of directors of the U.S. government incorporated that divide up and serve as individual boards for the different companies that make up our conglomerate. And they've got to oversee basically the basic tool of management control, the budgeting process. And it is a full-time plus job to be a competent, productive member of a congressional committee.
Right.
The Senate is supposed to be the board of directors of the White House.
Right.
And, but they get themselves involved in too many other issues.
Well, that's been my whole thing as a systems guy. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off, but as a systems guy, I look at this thing and I go, it's not, this is too big. That's right. It's too big, guys. This is not, you can't have a single system now manage all of this. You need multiple independent systems, interdependent systems that handle these tasks themselves.
Right.
And then share relevant information.
That's right. And live with the fact that inefficiency is inherent
in the system.
Entropy is in the system.
You got to build it in. We call it Murphy in the engineering word, Murphy's Law.
Exactly.
Okay, yeah, I only need a bearing that can hold 6,000 pounds, so I'm going to put one in that'll hold 8 because I don't want to have to be replacing that every 2 years. I want to be replacing it every 4 to 6 years. You know, where you can institutionally, and it's cost effective, you build Murphy in, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
It's kind of the same.
There is the secondary slogan, Murphy was an optimist.
Yeah.
But I mean, Hofstadter's law, or the planning fallacy.
Mm-hmm.
Things take longer and cost more than you think they're going to, even when you take into account Hofstadter's law.
Absolutely.
Right. So, I mean, for example, we have the perennial and stupid argument about states' rights. And it's stupid because there's actually nobody in favor of states' rights. People are in favor of rights for their states.
Right.
I mean, anybody, they always got something in mind where they want their state to be able to go its own way. Now, states have roles. There's no doubt about that. But we're now stuck with 50 when there was 13 of them that was plausible.
Right.
With 50, it's no longer plausible. The only way to even do something approximating that, I mean, I'd love to see the U.S. create sort of like, 7 to 9, large areas, and put a vice president in charge of each one, and then allow more regional control.
Yeah,
And
that's the whole right. Because the further it's separated from the citizen, the less representative it's going to be. So the concept
well,
with what you're saying there is to try to move more representation closer to the individual.
well,
Yeah.
there's also an ebb and flow in organizations. This is something my wife taught me. She said, because of entropy, what happens is there's a cycle. Things are a mess. So what you have to do is you have to move them in and centralize them to clean them up and standardize. If you hold them there, they become stagnant, unwilling to deal with exceptions, and cause problems. So you then turn around and push it back out to local autonomy so that they can customize and tweak it and make it fit the variety of circumstances in the field. And over time, it breaks down and becomes chaotic. And therefore, then you have to bring it all back in to clean it up. And it's like a breathing cycle. I would never argue that there is a consistently right single layer of close to the people government. I mean, it's a regular cycle, and depending on the issues, you want all the levels because each level adds its own contribution.
You have to consider the quality of the people as part of that equation, right?
Sadly, you can't, because no matter how qualified the person is that's in it, sooner or later, every job will be filled by someone unfit to hold it.
That's what I mean. That's right. Because that's going to constantly change. Then the like you were saying, the amount of how close or far representation is from the people is going to have to change necessarily, right?
That's but what do you want? You want a system that can route around damage and contain it. It's very difficult, regardless of your opinion of either the current or previous occupants of the White House. The fact is that none of them, there's a limit to what any of them could do.
Exactly.
This speculation that Trump is going to order a nuclear strike. He can't. He simply can't, because he would give the order and the general to whom he gave it would resign.
Yeah, right.
And then it would go, because they're not, it would very quickly, and then they'll leak it to the paper. Because the military knows how to play this game.
Right.
They can do so much damage and no more. Frankly, I'm not even sure that Kim Jong-il could quite push the button on his own, because his generals will all know what's going to happen.
Right.
I mean, if atomic weapons turn out, I mean, Dr. Strangelove was right. They're only good as doomsday weapons.
Exactly. Yeah.
The one circumstance in which the United States could legitimately use nuclear weapons with the support of the world is in response to a nuclear attack.
They're more powerful possessed than used.
That's right.
Yeah.
Why does Iran want them? Because then we cannot possibly invade.
Right.
We cannot invade North Korea.
Yep.
We could not,
Well, there's certainly that trend, isn't there? That the countries that get invaded tend to not have nuclear weapons, and the ones that do have nuclear weapons tend to not get invaded. Okay, so
the Indian army is a lot bigger than the Pakistani army.
Right.
But fine, they probably can't wipe out more than 5 or 6 cities on each side. But the thing is, that's enough.
That's enough, right?
Israel. I don't know how many nukes they've got, but they have every reason for us to believe they've got a number of them.
Right.
Because what it means is they say, you might be able to make us lose, but you're going with us.
Holy cow, we've gone down a rabbit hole here, haven't we?
But that's but notice, talking about war novels.
Yeah.
I mean, war is, there's a von Clausewitz, the continuation of diplomacy with the addition of other means. And it is always about the principle of the objective, and which is also project management.
Yeah.
What is it that you are trying to achieve?
Mm-hmm.
The understanding of what you're trying to achieve pushes you toward certain strategy and certain tactics.
Yep.
Yeah.
And what people know, there's no rules to war. Yes, there are. There are the rules that have to do with achieving your objective. If you're liberating a friendly civilian population from enemy control, you want to treat the civilians very carefully.
Right.
If you're going through a hostile population with citizenry that hate you and will all try to shoot you, you behave differently. Right? And the rules.
That's just kind of how it works.
Exactly.
Like it or not.
That's right. Because, well, every war is aimed at achieving an objective.
Right.
The first rule is if you don't know what the objective is, you've already lost.
Right.
And then once you have decided on the objective, then the principle of the objective and nothing else shapes and governs the decisions that you must make. Schwarzkopf, Persian Gulf. It's out of my seminar. All right, what has he got? We all know the joke. Did you want it good, fast, or cheap? Pick two, right?
Right.
That's called the triple constraints, the hierarchy of constraint into driver, middle, and weak. And within time, cost, and scope, the driver is the one you can't fail without failing the whole project. I mean, if Schwarzkopf comes back and says, "Hey, Mr. President, sorry I lost, but in my defense, I had to schedule and under budget."
Right.
Oh, that doesn't work, right?
The operation was a success, but the patient still died.
Right. Yeah. Right. So in that scope is the objective. Scope is the driver. Middle is time because the clock is ticking. International support, willingness of the Saudis to let us base there, and the weak constraint therefore has to be cost. And so what does he do? He brings over the equivalent of 5 NFL teams to play a high school squad.
Right.
Now we don't want to be wasteful. So what is the rationale for that? Well, the first one is the objective is not win to general, but rather get the Iraqis out of Kuwait, right? So the first thing about bringing over an overwhelming force is there's a chance that Saddam will say, "Oh, okay, you're that serious about it. I'm going to go home." Didn't happen, but that's all right. Then the second part of it is they tried the bombing campaign, scare them out. That doesn't happen. But they brought in the force. Now, the hidden objective on this one is casualties. I mean, if there's 50,000 dead American troops, it will not be called a victory.
Right.
And so a lot of planning goes into keeping casualties low. What is the point of the overwhelming force? Well, notice it affects the morale of the opposition.
Sure, it does. Yep.
Large numbers of Iraqi, because it's one thing to say you might be willing to fight and die for your country, but it's completely different when you realize that you're nothing but a speed bump. Right. So it's Miller time, right? Not that part of the world, but you know what I'm saying.
Right.
And so time in this one you have a scope time cost project, and you leverage that to help you achieve your objective.
It's kind of why nobody is going to ever do a stand-up war against the United States again. It's still from that, I would say, still today.
Because if we lose badly enough, we always have the doomsday weapon. So you can make us lose a little bit.
Right.
We can lose a battle and we won't go nuclear on you.
So really the trick is it's that slow, constant drip. Okay.
That's right.
That's what we're sort of kind of stuck in right now, isn't it?
Well, it's because that objectives are not necessarily reciprocal. That is, in Iraq, our victory condition is, in the second Iraq War, is we turn Iraq into a peaceful, stable, democratic nation, and then we go home. And the Iraqi opposition's point of view is, we go home, they win. We have overwhelmingly the bigger force, but they have the far easier objective.
Right.
Right. So, I mean, this kind of thing, again, I find endlessly fascinating. I heard a Soviet military commander speak about this some time back, and he said, "You Americans went into Iraq, and you didn't seem to think that this is a country that could not beat Iran in 10 years after the revolution."
Right.
Wow.
You know,
yep.
It's these things get to be interesting and complicated. And there are people, Schwarzkopf being one of them, who understand it well enough to work in it. But a lot of times, the people's understanding of the objective or their willingness to allow to face the consequences of the objective, that seems to escape folks.
Yeah, infinitely more complex than anybody would ever know.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And I mean, and that is, I guess, where a lot of my thinking goes. And what you're trying to do is make the complex accessible without pretending the complexity doesn't exist. You can summarize some of it or just hint at it, and at least people know it's there. But framing it and getting it across.
Well, so problem solving is a process that's fairly simple. However, problems are what are complex, and that's where it kind of gets where I think where people get it confused. You know what I mean? Where basic
problem solving methodology. Make sure you understand the problem, come up with options. Analyze the options.
Yeah. And so anyway, wow, we kind of got off on a tangent there. We're gonna have to start doing a current events type thing and having him just come on for those.
I find it fascinating and highly educating. I was just listening. Educating. I was just listening. Yeah, just listening to it unfold.
But you ask what is it that ties together a lot of the things that I've done? It's that appreciation of it in a weird way. I don't know if you read any of the World War II novels, but to my mind, at least my parts of it, a lot of the action scenes are in staff meetings.
Like the decision makers arguing, that kind of stuff.
Yes.
Oh,
right.
Okay. Yes.
I in my head, I treat them and I write them as if they're combat scenes.
Oh, okay. That's interesting. Wow.
And it was just a carryover from my day job, because if you notice that almost everybody talks about their place of work using military metaphors.
Yeah.
People then describe their offices as war zones.
Yeah. Or going to work as going to battle, or
And on all of those overarching dynamics of interactions and those hierarchies of things like that, from hierarchies of war to office politics, that's really what you're into studying, those structures and those interactions, and you're applying those to novels, and you're applying those to dialogues in novels, and you're applying that to war game mechanisms and life in general.
Oh, I remember an argument I got into with Mark Akers back in this La Grande Armée SPI game that way back in the Dark Ages. One thing that came up, we were playing it so I could learn how to play it well enough to do the rules editing, and there were named generals that added a big morale boost, and if your general got killed, this was a big problem. And I said, what if Napoleon gets killed? and we ended up having to write an entire additional set of rules to cope with. I mean, if Ney gets killed, that's one thing. It's bad, but it's not, but if Napoleon gets killed, that's the ballgame.
Yeah, right. What's the objective after that?
It is funny because you guys were talking about how this type of terminology and stuff gets translated. It gets translated into sports too, right?
It does.
And that was, it's something that's always kind of, I don't want to say it bothered me, but I don't know any other word to say, because when I found out that companies were issuing, was it The Art of War?
Yeah.
Okay. Sun Tzu, exactly.
Yeah.
And
it's a great business book.
That was written for people that were killing each other, not for people that were trying to make the most off of you know what I mean?
But don't confuse the process with the objective. Killing people is not the objective of the war.
Yeah, but do you think that sometimes that line gets blurred?
It does, but I would argue that one of the most successful generals of the 20th century is Gandhi.
Sure, yeah, who has a platform of peace, right?
And that's what you're saying. You're saying pay attention.
He was not a man of peace. He was a man of nonviolence.
Good distinction. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Good distinction. Yep.
What is the objective of a war? Is to force your enemy to do your will. Right.
Yep.
Okay.
And that's the only thing that then you have victory. If they do not do your will, you did not win. So it's possible for both sides to lose in a war. And you have this because negotiation is not solving the problem and the issue is intolerable. So von Clausewitz says that one of the things that you must do, and the objective of war, is to do everything possible to eliminate your enemy's ability to resist. That's sometimes destroying a weapons depot is more productive than shooting a bunch of soldiers.
Right.
In terms of degrading the enemy's ability to resist you. So what happens is his side's got very few guns. The British have lots of guns. What does he do? By going with Satyagraha, the nonviolence approach is fine. The British shot him like once or twice, but the world press hit they took was so bad, and even the back home hit they took was so
Right.
bad that they became unable to use their weapons.
Right.
So the British lost a lot. I mean, they didn't lose a lot of men, but they lost their major ability to fight.
Right.
And so it is. The British did not want to leave India,
No.
and they were forced out when it became untenable, and so this was a war. The fact that it was non-violent,
Nonetheless, right. The results are still the same.
right?
Yeah.
And in certain kinds of business, if you're battling competitors, you should think Sun Tzu or von Clausewitz, because you have an enemy. If you're talking about conquering open lands, and there is no effective resistance force there, it's a different approach, and you're going to be thinking of it from a slightly different perspective. But battling competitive moves
Right.
is a big thing. So companies like that are certainly going to think about it. I mean, not all wars are projects, though not all projects are wars. And how do you know it's a war? It's because you have an enemy. And your enemy changes your risk profile, because, I might run over a nail and get a flat tire, but I'm not going to run over an IED unless somebody puts it there.
Yeah. Now, accepting that, though, sometimes the best way to deal with your enemy in business is not to destroy them. It could be to collaborate. It could be to joint venture. It could be, it's so many other things.
Battle on one. That's right, because unconditional surrender is not always the goal.
Right.
Sometimes it's, we want to fight over this one issue, and another reason some wars are very limited is we don't want to compromise our entire relationship, but we cannot accept this, and we're going to have to fight this one out the hard way. So you can have all of these sort of limited issues, and the ability to patch up things afterwards.
Right.
An enemy is defined as having two characteristics: incompatible interests and a bad personal relationship. If they're competing interests, but the relationship is okay, then they're opponents, which is slightly different.
Yeah.
The relationship is something you want to preserve.
Mm-hmm.
There are people with whom you have a shared interest, but no good relationship. They're fellow travelers. You can do business with them, but you have to be very careful on limits. And the people with a good relationship and compatible interests, those are your allies. But notice people can flip back and forth between the allies and the opponent's box.
Yeah.
And so nations, we have no permanent friends, we have no permanent enemies, we have permanent interests.
Right.
And I mean, otherwise, remember, we weren't that happy with the British after 1776.
For a while.
For a while. That's right.
For a while.
Right.
There were some grudges there, certainly.
There were. And people do. One thing that von Clausewitz said was very interesting is that war degenerates. It's that at first it is, we are marching to achieve our national objective. That's why we fight. And then finally it becomes, we're fighting because you killed my buddy.
Yeah.
And as soon as I kill two more of you to make up for it, I'm willing to quit.
Right.
And then that puts everybody on the, on
the negative
path.
side of the equation. Right. So it's always, you're just eye for an eyeing until
That's right.
everyone's dead.
That's right. That's right. I mean, to my mind, the general who truly won World War II was George C. Marshall, and to some extent MacArthur, because the goal was to make Germany and Japan no longer enemies to world peace.
Right.
The military victory was not enough to ensure that was going to happen.
By itself.
By itself, it was the Marshall Plan and MacArthur's service as shogun that truly made a peace we have other problems in this world, but Germany and Japan aren't among them.
Well, yeah, because even after the hostilities stop, somebody's got to agree to not fight anymore, right?
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. That's right. And it's my father had a college roommate was German. He applied to be an exchange student at Davidson College in North Carolina, and Dad spoke some German from his days in the POW camp. So they said, "You mind taking his German as your roommate?" He says, "No, it's fine with me." And they said, "By the way, we can't read this on his job, his admission. He was talking about youth activities, and he's got HJ. Do you know what that means?" And my father, of course, knew what that meant, but didn't say. It's Hitler Jugend.
Oh man,
that's right. But then everybody was a member. I mean, you had no choice.
Right, right.
Afterwards, the guy went back to Germany, went into politics. His name was Kurt Biedenkopf. He became minister president of Saxony and head of the Christian Democratic Party, which and really did all of this, partly an American education. When my brother was stationed over in Germany, he got into some trouble, and he called my dad. "What am I going to do? I really messed up." And Dad says, "I'll take care of it." Called Kurt. And Kurt shows up in the Mercedes with the flags flying.
Diplomatic plates, right?
Right. Well, I mean, German executive plates.
Right.
The guy comes in and says, "I'm here to see Staff Sergeant Pat Dobson." He says, "What the hell have you done?" And Pat, who'd been briefed, says, "Oh, Uncle Kurt."
It's causing an international incident.
Make sure they didn't cause one.
Oh, thank God.
Yeah.
But that's always good. My father, that's one of the lessons. I've collected those folks. I ask people about themselves. I was teaching a seminar a few weeks ago, and I mentioned I was from Alabama, and this black gentleman said, "Oh, I'm from Alabama too." And I said, "Really, where?" And he said, "Selma." And he looked to be the right age, so I asked him. And it turned out he was 10 years old on the Edmund Pettus Bridge on Bloody Sunday.
Wow.
So very interesting conversation. At Bettis Marine Propulsion, the people who build the powertrains for nuclear reactors and subs and aircraft carriers, I met a guy, elderly gentleman, who told me a story that when he was in high school, he had a friend who wanted to be a musician and it booked some time in a recording studio, and he'd come along, and they're eating lunch before their appointment, and they meet the band that's going before them, and they weren't sure what they're going to play. So he sat down and worked out a chord progression for them, which turned out to be Wipeout by the Surfaris. I mean, people have amazing stories. Our mortgage broker, when we moved into the neighborhood, I live outside DC now, and turned out to be the daughter of Jack Anderson, the newspaper columnist. One of the big people who broke the Watergate story. And she told me how Anderson got the White House tapes before Congress. It seems that Jack Anderson had a White House janitor on his payroll who'd steal the one-use carbon paper out of the trash can each night. And so Laurie, when she was in high school, she'd have to tape the carbons to a lampshade.
Right, and then transcribe them.
Yeah. Wow. There are, I mean, there are thousands and thousands of these, and I feel richer every time I run into one. I mean, my friend my has the biggest one. When the new president of Peru was elected, Pedro Pablo, I forget his last name. He says, "Oh, Pedro Pablo," he said, "he used to work for me, at the World Bank. He was offered a job back in Peru in finance, asked me if I should take it. I said, you go take it, and if it doesn't work out, you come back, I'll hire you back." So he wrote him a little congratulatory note, and the Peruvian embassy sent a delegation over to thank him.
Wow. That's awesome.
But this is but that's DC. The woman across the street from me died about 6 months ago, and I discovered at her funeral that she had been one of the Hidden Figures women from the movie, the NASA black female mathematician.
Oh, she was one of the actual mathematicians, though.
Yeah. She wasn't one in the movie, but she was on that group.
Gotcha.
At Goddard. And so it's a wonderful and rich world, but the more you find out about it, the less you think that anything's simple.
Right.
What is it? H.L. Mencken? For every problem, there is an answer that is obvious, straightforward, simple, and wrong.
That's a perfect analogy for the world today, isn't it not?
and maybe that will be a good time to wrap it.
Okay.
Whether we've overrun any willing listener, but it's certainly I've had a very good time, and I thank you very much for inviting me.
No, it was absolutely fantastic, Michael. And look, if anything comes up in the future here, anything you're working on, or if you just want to come back and just rap with us for a couple hours, bud, we would love to have you back.
Absolutely. It was fascinating talking with you, and thank you very much.
Well, thank you. If you ever get desperate for guests, I'm always around.
Well, folks,
thanks again, and thank you to any listeners who are brave enough to stick all the way to the end.
All right, well, folks, thanks for listening to the show. We'll catch you next time.
Bye.